I was about 26 when this happened. I wasn't a park ranger yet. Not officially, though I'd done some seasonal work up near Estes Park and helped out with trail maintenance and backcountry signage during the summers. At the time, I was staying with my girlfriend, now my wife, at a small cabin that her uncle owned, tucked into a thick patch of pine and fir not too far from the San Juan Mountains in southern Colorado. It was late September, one of those windows of time when the aspens were turning gold and the air was cool in the shade but still warm when the sun hit just right. We had about 2 weeks off from work and were using it to get away from everything. The cabin itself sat in a shallow bowl of forest, with a small dirt road curling down into it. There was one other cabin about a mile to the west, some retired couple from Pueblo, I think, but we never saw them the whole time we were out there. Maybe they'd already gone back to town for the season. A rough trail ran down the valley for about 3 miles and hit a small, primitive campground near the river. Other than that, we didn't see another soul the whole trip. That day, I'd gone out fishing in the late afternoon. I had my light rod and a small canvas pack slung over my shoulder with a few basic supplies: knife, flashlight, water bottle, a snack, some flies, and lures. I wasn't going far, just to the river about 15 minutes downhill through the woods from the cabin. I liked that spot. The water was clear and cold, with a few calm eddies off to the side where the trout liked to sit beneath the surface. Most of the fish were small browns and cutthroats, nothing to brag about, but I wasn't in it for the trophy. Just the rhythm of it, the peace. I must have been out there for a couple of hours. Caught maybe 3 fish worth keeping and tossed the rest back. I was standing in the shallows, water curling around my boots, just casting and breathing and watching the late light filter through the trees. The sun had dipped behind the western ridge, and shadows were starting to stretch across the water when I decided to call it. I packed up, clipped my stringer to my belt, and started heading back uphill toward the cabin. It was quiet in the woods. Not just the kind of quiet you expect from forest at dusk, but something deeper, almost heavy. No son, no chatev. Just the sound of my boots crunching in the leaf litter and the faint slosh of fish bumping against my leg. I figured maybe the drop in temperature had calmed things down. The woods do that sometimes, especially in the shoulder seasons. Everything gets still. I made about 5 minutes up the trail when I noticed a feeling. It was subtle at first. Just that sense, somewhere between instinct and suspicion, that I wasn't alone. I stopped walking and stood there for a second, turning my head slowly from left to right. The trees were dense, but not choking. I could see a good 10 yards in any direction before the branches and trunks blurred things together. Nothing moved. I listened hard, but all I could hear was the wind. I kept walking, maybe a little faster. My boots caught on roots and the tips of buried rocks as I climbed. The sun was gone now. The sky above was pale blue, fading into ash. It was going to be dark soon. That's when I heard it, the sound of a stick snapping. It wasn't loud, not dramatic. Just a quick, sharp crack behind me, maybe 10 or 15 yards off the trail. I froze, heart ticking a little faster. Slowly, I turned and scanned the woods. Nothing. I stood there for a full 30 seconds, maybe more. My eyes traced every tree trunk, every shadow. I didn't hear anything else. No rustling, no movement, just stillness again. The kind of stillness that feels unnatural. I tried to shrug it off and told myself it was probably a deer or maybe even a porcupine rooting around in the brush. I started walking again. My ears were on high alert now, tuned for anything out of place. I hadn't gone more than another 50 feet when I heard it again. Another stick snapped, almost identical to the first. I whipped around fast this time, scanning hard. I even stepped off the trail a few feet and leaned to the side, trying to see past a stand of young firs. Still nothing. No movement, no shapes ducking behind cover. Just dark trunks and the soft sweep of fallen needles. My brain was racing now. I knew these woods well enough to know there were mountain lions in the area. Rare to see one, even rarer to be stalked, but not impossible. They're ambush predators. They'll follow you, sometimes, get close enough to strike, wait for a weakness. But they're ghosts in the forest. You almost never see them coming. I started walking again, but faster now. The trail wasn't steep, but it was enough of an incline to make my calves start burning. I kept my head on a swivel, scanning left and right, checking behind me every couple of seconds. The woods were getting darker by the minute. Shadows moved differently now, longer, stretching in ways that made the ground seem uncertain. My fish were swinging against my thigh with every step, making soft, wet noises that started to irritate me. Then I heard a third time. This time the sound came from closer, maybe 10 feet behind me and off to the right. Not just a stick snap. This time I swore I heard a footfall. One, heavy enough to be deliberate. I spun again and crouched slightly, trying to get a lower angle through the underbrush. Still nothing. No shape, no eyes, no puff of breath. Just those trees, still and silent. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I thought about dropping the fish. If it was a lion, maybe the scent was drawing it in. I hesitated. They weren't big fish, and it seemed stupid at the time, but I unclipped the stringer and tossed them into the brush anyway. Then I stood there and waited. Another minute. Another two. I even reached into my bag and slid my hand over the handle of my fixed blade just to feel something solid. No more sounds. No more movement. I started walking again, almost jogging now. I was maybe a quarter mile from the cabin. The woods thinned a little up ahead, and I could see the outline of a granite outcropping I used as a landmark. My heart was thudding in my chest now. I couldn't shake the idea that something was right behind me, just out of sight, just beyond the line of trees. Stalking me. I was sweating hard despite the cold. My breath was loud, ragged. I kept glancing over my shoulder, every step expecting something to leap or charge or scream. But it never came. I hit the edge of the clearing around the cabin just as the last of the daylight vanished. There was a small woodpile off to one side and the shadowy shape of the fire ring we'd used the night before. The cabin's window glowed faintly from the oil lamp inside. I walked straight to the front door and didn't stop until I was inside, bolting it behind me and dropping my pack on the floor. I stood there in the dim light, chest heaving, ears still straining for sound from outside. But nothing came. I didn't hear any more snaps. No footsteps. No breathing. Whatever had been following me, if it was something real, was gone. I waited a long time before peeling off my jacket and sitting down at the little table by the window. My hands were still trembling slightly. I watched the dark woods through the glass, expecting to see movement. But the trees just stood there, still and silent. I didn't tell anyone about it that night. I didn't want to scare her, and I wasn't even sure what I'd experienced myself. I kept replaying the sounds over and over in my head, trying to match them to something normal. An animal, a branch falling, maybe even another person, but none of it made sense. The next morning, I went back down to the river. I didn't tell her where I was going, just said I wanted to check something. I followed the same trail, retraced my steps. The woods were different in the daylight. Brighter, warmer, safer. I didn't feel that same pressure on my back. I didn't hear anything following me. When I reached the spot where I tossed the fish, I found them lying exactly where I'd left them. Half frozen in the cold air, eyes glazed. Untouched. No claw marks. No bite. Not even disturbed leaves around them. If something had been tracking me for food, it would have taken those fish. They were fresh and easy, but they were just lying there like no one had come near them. I walked the perimeter for a while, trying to spot tracks or droppings or anything that would give me a clue. But the ground was dry, and there wasn't much to read. Just a lot of pine needles and frost-hardened dirt. I gave up after about half an hour and made my way back. I didn't fish again that week. I stayed close to the cabin. Cut wood, read books, clean up around the yard. I kept a knife on my belt the whole time and made sure I didn't wander too far into the trees. That feeling stuck with me like a hangover. Not fear exactly, more like a low-level hum of alertness that wouldn't fade. After we got home, I tried to forget about it, but it stuck with me for years. Still does sometimes. When I started working as a ranger, I ran into other people with similar stories. Not identical, but close. Feeling watched, hearing steps, something just out of reach. We always chalked it up to mountain lions or bears or even just overactive nerves. But the thing is, mountain lions don't usually follow you that long without making a move. And they sure as hell don't ignore a free meal lying in the dirt. I don't know what it was. Probably a cat, I guess. Maybe a bear, though I never smelled one. Maybe even a person, though that idea felt worse in a way. Whatever it was good. I've lived in the Smoky Mountains most of my life. Born here, raised here, and probably going to die here too. It's the kind of place that gets in your bones, whether you like it or not. I've been a park ranger for going on 15 years now, and before that, I worked trail maintenance and guided tours in the backcountry. Even as a kid, I'd sneak off into the woods, build little shelters, listen to the birds, and try to identify their calls. Out here, you don't just learn the land, you become a part of it. I've lived in different cabins and houses scattered around the area, mostly depending on what station I was working out of. But no matter where I've been, I've always been surrounded by forest. Towering trees, thick underbrush, wildlife all around. Out here, even your own breath can sound too loud. But it's home. My current place is a modest little cabin just off a gravel road that winds a few miles out from one of the main ranger stations. Nothing fancy. One bedroom, a small kitchen, a porch that wraps around the front and one side. It's elevated just a bit, with wooden steps that creak whether you're walking up them or not. I built it myself, with help from a few old-timers who knew their way around a hammer and saw. Been here about 8 years now. Anyway, it was a summer night. I don't remember the exact date, but it was hot enough that the air felt heavy, and even the breeze was warm. The kind of night where you feel the sweat collect behind your knees just sitting still. I was out on the porch with a beer in hand. Just a regular old light lager I picked up from a store in town. The kind I've been drinking for years. The kind that tastes better when the bottle sweats more than you do. Now, if you've never spent a summer night in the Smokies, let me tell you, it's loud. Nature out here doesn't go to sleep. The cicadas buzz so loud they drown out your thoughts. Frogs croak from every low-lying puddle or creek. Crickets chirp like they're racing each other to some finish line. There's this constant hum, like a living, breathing engine of wild noise that just rolls on and on. It becomes the kind of white noise that you don't even notice after a while, until it stops. And that's exactly what happened that night. 1 second, I'm rocking back in my chair, listening to the chorus of the woods, sipping my beer. The next, it's like someone hit the mute button on the entire forest. No cicadas, no frogs, no night birds, not even the wind rustling the leaves. Just silence. It's hard to explain how wrong silence feels in a place that's never silent. It wasn't peaceful. It was like the forest was holding its breath. Like everything living out there suddenly decided it was safer not to make sound. And when you live out here long enough, you start to pay attention to those cues. When the animals go quiet, it usually means there's something out there that doesn't belong. I sat there for a few seconds, holding my beer halfway to my mouth, just listening. Nothing. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring. My skin started to prickle, and I wasn't sure if it was the heat or something else. Then I heard it. It came from maybe 30, 40 meters out, close enough to be clear, but far enough that I couldn't see anything from where I was sitting. It was a scream, a single, sharp, shrieking noise that tore through the silence like a knife. It was high-pitched, drawn out, and absolutely blood-curdling. I don't use that word lightly. It wasn't human. At least, it didn't sound like any human I've ever heard. And I've heard people scream on trails, in accidents, during search and rescue operations. This wasn't that. It wasn't a mountain lion, either. I've heard them, too, rare as they are. Their cries can sound like a woman screaming, sure, but there's a rhythm to it. A pattern. This was something else. One long, broken shriek that didn't sound like it should come from anything living. Like whatever made it wasn't built right. I didn't move at first. My body just kind of froze up. The hair on my arms stood straight up, and I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. It wasn't fear exactly, not yet, but something old and primal waking up inside me. A warning. A message I didn't need to hear twice. I stood up slowly. The boards under my feet creaked, loud in the silence. I set my beer down on the railing and looked out toward the tree line, but I couldn't see a damn thing. Just blackness beyond the edge of my porch light. I knew those woods better than I know most people. Every ridge, every hollow, every creek. But right then, they felt like a stranger. I don't know why I said it out loud. Maybe to break the silence, maybe to ground myself, but I remember just muttering, nope, and turning around. Walked straight back inside, locked the door behind me, and didn't bother turning off the porch light. That was the end of it. The sound didn't come again. After a few minutes, the forest started to come back to life, like someone slowly turned up the volume. The cicadas started buzzing again. Frogs croaked like nothing had happened. But I didn't go back outside that night. Over the next few days, I kept an ear out. Hiked that part of the woods more than once, looking for tracks, signs of anything unusual. I didn't find anything. No strange prints, no disturbed brush, no carcasses. Just the same trails, the same woods I'd known for years. People ask me if I ever figured out what it was. I haven't. And to be honest, I don't need to. Sometimes, out here, the mountains give you a warning. You don't have to understand it to listen to it. That scream, whatever it was, wasn't meant for me to chase down. It was a message, plain and simple. Stay inside tonight. And I did. I still live in that same house. Still drink the same beer, sit on the same porch. Nothing like that has ever happened again. The woods have gone back to being just woods. Loud, wild, beautiful. But every now and then, when the cicadas stop for just a beat too long, or the frogs all go quiet once, I feel it again. That stillness, that memory. And when that happens, I go back inside. Simple as that. Some things in the woods aren't meant to be found, and some warnings are best left untested. I used to be a park ranger in Colorado, out near the San Juan Mountains. Beautiful place. Thick pine forests, sharp crags cutting up the sky, rivers so cold and clear they looked like glass. You could hike for days without seeing another person. It was that kind of place, peaceful, sure, but also the kind of place that made you feel small, like you didn't really belong there. Nature was in charge, not you. This story isn't exactly mine, not originally. It's something my old man told me when I was young, but I've walked the same trails, breathed that same cold pine air, and I believe every word he said. The way he told it stuck with me. And after being out there myself for years, I've had enough quiet, tense walks through those woods to know the feeling he was talking about. He never made a big thing out of it, never told it like some campfire ghost story. He told it straight, plain, just like it happened. And that's what made it worse somehow. Back in the late 1980s, he was in his 20s. He and my mom had rented out this small cabin for a week in late summer. It sat on the slope of a valley, about a mile from the next nearest cabin, which was often empty. There was a campground maybe 3 miles further down, past the ridge and along a dirt service road, but they hadn't seen anyone around that week. Probably too late in the season for most tourists. They had no electricity in the cabin, just a propane lamp, a wood stove, and a battery radio. Running water came from a gravity-fed tank up the hill, and the place smelled like old timber and wet moss. To most people, it would feel isolated. To them, it was perfect. One late afternoon, my dad went down to the river, maybe half a mile downhill from the cabin. The sun was still up, but low enough that shadows stretched out long across the forest floor. The water was running steady that day, not too high, cold and clear. He fished there for hours, barely caught anything, just enjoying the quiet. You know the kind of quiet you get out in the woods? Not real silence, but the soft sounds of nature. A breeze shaking needles loose, the distant flap of bird wings, the river tumbling over rocks. That kind of quiet wraps around you. When the light started to fade into that dim golden blue, he decided to head back. The temperature drops quick in the Colorado woods after sundown, and he wasn't dressed for the cold. He packed up his gear, gave the line one last shake, and turned toward the trail that led back to the cabin. It wasn't an official trail, just a worn path that curved along the riverbank, cut across a dry patch, then climbed up through some switchbacks. The cabin was up on a ridge, tucked between two big old spruce trees that creaked when the wind blew hard. He knew that walk well. It wasn't far, maybe 20 minutes, but it got steep and dark quick. About 5 minutes into the walk, just past where the trail leaves the river, he got that feeling. He always described it as a weight. Not like something pressing on your body, but more like the air had thickened. That shift in the atmosphere when something isn't right. Like stepping into a room where someone's been fighting, even if you didn't hear the shouting. He kept walking. The trees got thicker along that stretch, close enough that their branches crossed above the trail and filtered out what little light was left. His boots crunched through dry pine needles, and every now and then he'd step on a root or rock and have to catch himself. The forest was quiet, a bit too quiet. Then he heard it, a stick breaking behind him. He froze, turned around slow, eyes scanning the trees, but there was nothing. Just rows of pine and shadow. No wind, no birds, nothing moving. He waited, held his breath, listening. When nothing followed, he chalked it up to maybe a branch falling or a squirrel making trouble. He turned back around and kept walking. A little faster this time. Another sound. Same kind. A crack like weight on dry wood. He spun around, faster now. Still nothing. Just more trees, more dark. The path behind him looked different now. Hard to tell where the trail was exactly, and it felt like the woods were crowding in. He took a deep breath and kept going, not wanting to look like a fool by running, but not comfortable enough to walk easy either. He went maybe another 100 yards before it happened again. This time, 2 cracks. Closer. He said it felt like whatever was following him had paused when he paused, crept when he moved. He didn't run, but he walked fast. Almost too fast, slipping on loose dirt and dry needles. He said the worst part was that every time he turned around, he expected to see something. An animal, maybe, or a person, but there was never anything. He thought maybe it was a mountain lion. They stalk like that. Quiet, patient, testing. And that made it worse. Because mountain lions don't make mistakes. If you see one, it's usually because it wants you to see it. But this one, if it was a lion, stayed hidden the whole time. He got to the last switchback before the ridge, and the light was nearly gone. Just that dim blue before night fully falls. The cabin was maybe 50 yards uphill, hidden from view. He could see the tips of the spruces over the ridge line, but not the roof. That's when he heard the sound again. Close. Too close. Maybe 10 feet behind him. He didn't turn this time. He just walked. Kept going. Up the trail, over the ridge, and didn't stop until he saw the outline of the cabin. He reached the door, fumbled the latch, and shut it hard behind him. Inside, my mom had the lamp going. She said he looked pale, like he'd seen something. But he didn't tell her right away. Just stood at the window, watching the tree lean, listening. But there was nothing. No movement. No more sounds. He never did see what followed him. And it didn't come back. Not that night. Not any other during their stay. He told himself later that it was a mountain lion. That made the most sense. But he admitted, even years later, that something fell off. Not just the stalking, but the timing, the silence, the way it always stopped when he did. He said he'd been followed before plenty of times. Out in the field, animals test you. But this didn't feel like that. He didn't talk about it much. Just that one time, and then maybe a passing mention years later when I was heading out for ranger training. He just said, always listen to your gut out there. You don't always see the danger, but your body knows. When I started working in those same forests, I carried that with me. And I had my own close calls. Once got caught between a black bear and her cubs. Another time, slipped on a ridge and nearly went off the edge. But the one that got me the most was a night I spent alone at a backcountry outpost cabin. Just me, a radio, and the forest. I woke up around 2 a.m. No reason. Just wide awake, heart racing. Like a shot of adrenaline had hit me in my sleep. I sat up listening. At first, I heard nothing. Then way out in the trees, a crunch. One, then another. Something walking slow. I never saw it. It never came close. But I didn't sleep the rest of that night. Sat by the window with a flashlight and a field knife. Just in case. Come morning, there were no tracks. Nothing disturbed. But I remember what my dad had said. You don't always see the danger. Now, years later, I think about that trail he walked up from the river. I've hiked it myself. Still steep. Still narrow. Still quiet. I even fished that same bend in the river. And every time I do, I feel it. That hush. That weight. We like to think we understand the wild. That we can map it, name it, manage it. But out there, in those thick woods, you're just a guest. You don't make the rules. You just hope you make it back. My dad made it back that night. Didn't talk about it much. Didn't let it scare him off. But left a mark. Not a scar. Just a reminder. A whisper in the back of your mind when the trail goes quiet and the light starts to fade. Sometimes, being watched doesn't mean you're in danger. But sometimes it does. Thanksgiving week of 2013, I took time off from my usual ranger duties and headed out to camp with a few old friends from my days working Forest Service downstate. It was a tradition for us, something we'd done for years. Our camp wasn't anything fancy, just a small, weather-beaten cabin tucked in a patch of woods in a remote part of the state, nestled between a few other camps and sparsely spread out homes. You had to know the area to find it. You turned off a main highway onto a gravel road, followed that for about a mile, then veered off again onto another gravel track for another half-mile. After that, it was all trees, brush, and silence. Most of the time, the quiet was part of the charm. You'd hear a coyote now and then, or a bobcat if you were unlucky. Bobcats always gave me the creeps more than anything else because of the way they scream. It doesn't sound like an animal. It sounds like a woman crying for help. That first time I heard one back when I was doing patrols alone on a late winter night, I almost called it in as a domestic violence call before realizing what it was. There'd also been sightings of a black panther in the area over the years. Rare, but enough to make you wonder. And plenty of wild dogs, too. The kind you don't want to run into, especially after dark. They weren't pets gone feral. They were generations deep in the wild, lean and mean. The week started like it always did. We hunted during the day, fished along the creek when the sun was high, cooked over the fire, drank a bit too much some nights. It was cold, but not bitter. A few of the guys brought their sons along, and they kept the place lively, messing with fishing rods, running through the woods, chasing each other with sticks. On Thanksgiving Day itself, we set up a smoker out back and slow-cooked a few turkeys while the rest of us prepped potatoes and corn inside. The air smelled like wood smoke and meat for hours. It was the kind of peace you don't get in town or even on the job when you're supposed to be in nature. That night, after everyone else had gone to bed, a few of us older guys stayed out by the fire. There were 4 of us, bundled up in heavy coats, cradling beers in gloved hands, hats pulled low over our ears. The fire snapped and cracked while we traded old stories, some funny, some gross, and a few we always told even though they made us uncomfortable. We just liked the way they hung in the air when the flames were low and the night was quiet. That particular night, though, it was quieter than usual. Not just still, but muted like something was pressing down on everything around us. We were talking about a time back in '07 when one of the guys had shot a deer and then had to chase it nearly half a mile, only to find it tangled up in an old fence, still alive and thrashing. We were halfway through laughing when we heard it. Help me. The voice came from deeper in the woods, off behind the property line where the pine trees grew thick. It cut through the quiet like it didn't belong. A man's voice. It wasn't panicked exactly, but it was urgent. We all froze. Then it came again. Help me. It wasn't like a bobcat. It didn't have that high-pitched wail or the strange echo that bounces between trees. This sounded clear, human, close enough to make out, but not close enough to see. It was probably 50 yards off in the dark, maybe more, beyond the reach of the firelight. Nobody moved at first. Then, like clockwork, we all stood up. No one said a word, but every one of us stepped back into the cabin for our guns. Not because we were looking for trouble, but because out here, you don't go toward a strange sound in the woods at night unarmed. Our instincts were fighting each other. One part of us wanted to help, another part knew better. People try things in the woods sometimes. Lure you out. Doesn't have to be a trap, either. Could be someone high as a kite, dangerous, sick. Could be someone genuinely hurt. But you don't just run in blind. We circled back around to the fire, flashlights in hand, keeping the beams low so our night vision wouldn't be blown out. We listened. Help me. Again. Same distance. Same direction. No crashing through the underbrush. No movement. Just the voice. We waited a few minutes, then agreed someone had to call in. I took my phone out and got the local sheriff's office on the line. I explained what we heard, where we were, how many of us there were. They told us to stay put and said they'd send someone out to check the area. It took about 30 minutes for the first deputy to arrive. He came up the gravel in a marked SUV, lights off, moving slow. When he stepped out, he asked us a few questions. We explained it again. All the while, the woods were quiet. Dead quiet. The deputy stood with us near the fire for about 15 minutes, maybe 20. We all listened. Not a sound. No voice. No rustling. Nothing. He nodded, said he'd drive a slow loop around the back access road that cut through the woods behind us. and told us to let him know if anything changed. He left. Not 5 minutes later, we heard it again. Help me. Same voice. Same direction. We called again. A second deputy arrived about 15 minutes after that, and both of them were now posted nearby, one up the road, one parked at the clearing across from our camp. We didn't hear the voice while they were there. Not even once. This pattern went on for over an hour. The moment the officers left, we heard the voice. The moment they came back, silence. Each time, it came from the same general area, maybe a little farther in the last few times, but always faint enough that we couldn't get a real fix on it. We tried shining lights in the direction, even walked 20 yards into the tree line once, but nothing moved and the voice stopped every time we got near. Eventually, we all agreed to head inside and lock up for the night. It was close to midnight by then, temperature dropping hard. The inside of the cabin was warmer, but felt tight, like something was watching from the woods. I stayed awake most of the night, sitting by the window that faced the direction of the voice. I didn't hear it again after that. In the morning, one of the deputies came back. He told us they had patrolled the back trails and found nothing. No footprints, no signs of someone living rough out there, no clothing, no blood, no broken branches. Just clean, undisturbed forest. We stuck around the next day, but the mood had shifted. The usual fun was gone. Even the kids were quieter. No one wanted to talk about it too much, but you could tell it was on everyone's mind. When I left the camp 2 days later, I didn't plan on coming back. Not because I was scared exactly, but because it felt off. Like there was something I wasn't meant to understand about what happened. That voice didn't sound like someone dying. It didn't sound panicked. It just repeated the same thing, over and over, always in the same tone, always at the same distance. No movement, no change. Months went by. We heard nothing from the sheriff's office. No reports of missing people in that area. No follow-up calls. I checked with dispatch a few times myself, using my badge to ask around the law enforcement network. Nothing turned up. It was like whoever or whatever had called out to us never existed. I went back to the camp one time the following year out of guilt. The guys had invited me up for a weekend. I figured maybe enough time had passed that the weirdness would fade. But the moment I turned off the highway onto that gravel road, my chest got tight. I don't scare easy, not after what I've seen out on the job. But something about that stretch of woods sat wrong with me now. It was like the trees were holding on to something I couldn't see. The weekend passed without incident. No voices, no strange sounds, but I couldn't relax. I barely slept. I kept checking the windows, listening to the dark, waiting. I haven't been back since. There's a lot of talk out there about the woods being haunted or cursed, but I don't believe in that. I don't believe in monsters or spirits or anything else that can't bleed. But I do believe in people. And I believe people can do things to each other that leave marks, even in the dirt, even in the trees. Maybe someone died out there years ago and never got found. Maybe someone used to live out there, lost their mind, and wandered until the cold took them. Maybe that voice we heard was real, and we just couldn't find it in time. But what sticks with me, what I can't shake after all these years, is how it only came when we were alone. Like it knew when it was safe to speak. Like it was watching. We never found a body. Never found tracks. Never found anything at all. Just a voice. And I still hear it sometimes, not out loud, but in my head when I walk alone through quiet woods after sunset. That calm, steady voice drifting out between the trees. Help me, and I never know if I should follow it. I wasn't the one who lived through it, but when my younger sister told me what happened during her trip to Colorado, it stuck in my head like a splinter. She'd gone out west the summer before, late July or maybe early August, right when the high elevation trails start to open up but still have patches of snow hanging on in the shady areas. She was in her early 20s then, out of school for the summer, and wanted a break from everything back home. She's always been independent, the type who carries her own weight and doesn't ask for help unless she absolutely needs it. She had a friend with her, another woman around her age. They planned a short overnight hike. Nothing too ambitious, just a trail that wound up into the mountains with a small plateau, about halfway up, a good place to make camp before finishing the rest the next morning. It was one of those hikes that people sometimes underestimate. You start out in warm sun, breathing in dry air that smells like pine bark and dust, and it feels like an easy day trip. But altitude has a way of humbling people. It can change the weather in a heartbeat, and you can never really prepare for how fast your body stops cooperating above the tree line. They left late morning and made steady progress up the trail. It was steep but manageable, the kind of climb that pushes your legs but doesn't break them. They stopped a few times to drink water and eat some trail mix. My sister said the wildflowers were still out, a blanket of color in the open stretches. They passed a few day hikers coming back down, all of them saying something about clouds building to the west. But nothing looked too threatening when they reached the flat stretch they planned to camp on. Just some gray in the sky, a few gusts of wind picking up. They set up their tent, ate a light dinner, and started to wind down. She remembers the way the air changed before the storm hit. That quiet stillness that settles over everything, like the world is holding its breath. Then the rain came, heavy, cold, and sudden. It wasn't a quick summer shower either. It dumped all night, drumming on the tent like fingers on a steel drum. Everything felt soaked, even though they'd sealed their gear and used a rain fly. My sister said they barely slept. They could hear water running under the tent, could feel the cold pressing up through the sleeping pads. And in the back of her mind, she kept thinking, if this is rain here, that means snow up top. They got up the next morning, wet and tired, but determined to finish the hike. Her friend had only brought Chaco sandals, figuring it was a summer trail. But the higher they climbed, the more snow they saw clinging to the rocks and the trees. Not a dusting, either. Real accumulation, thick in places, crusted over where it had frozen overnight. They pushed ahead anyway, trying to make the summit. My sister had real boots, but even she was slipping a little. Her friend was struggling. Eventually, they stopped at a creek to reassess. The water was rushing, full from the night's rain, and bordered by patches of dirty snow. They were debating whether to turn around. The trail ahead looked worse. My sister was worried about her friend's footing and the risk of slipping. That's when they heard it. Faint, just above the sound of the water. "Help me." They both froze. The words were barely there, almost lost in the wind. My sister held her breath, trying to hear through the running creek and rustling leaves. Then again, "Help me." They looked at each other, both unsure what to do. It didn't sound close. It didn't sound urgent either, more like a weak, tired voice. But it was definitely a voice. They left their packs and started following the sound upstream, moving carefully along the slick rocks. Every few steps, they paused and listened. The voice didn't call out constantly, just enough to keep them going in the right direction. They came to a clearing a few hundred yards up. The snow was deeper there, a thick crust with soft spots underneath that soaked through their pants when they knelt. In the middle of it was a woman lying on her side, barely moving. She had on leggings, a thin pullover, and cheap athletic shoes, completely wrong for this kind of terrain. Her hair was wet and matted to her face. Her legs were swollen, red and purple, cut up from branches and rocks. She was curled in a half-fetal position, shivering, but not really responding to them at first. My sister knelt beside her and checked if she was breathing. She was awake too, but her eyes didn't focus right away. My sister asked how long she'd been out there. The woman muttered something about a few hours. My sister knew right then that wasn't right. Nobody gets that kind of exposure from just a few hours in cold weather. She asked her name, tried to gauge her awareness. The woman insisted her car was at the top of the mountain. My sister felt a chill deeper than the air. There were no roads up there. She told her friend they had to get her down now. No service to call for help, and no time to wait for someone else to come by. They each took one of the woman's arms and started walking her back toward the trail, then downhill. It was slow going. The woman could barely walk and kept trying to veer off in the wrong direction, insisting she needed to keep going up. My sister kept correcting her, gently but firmly. The trail was slick, and her friend kept losing footing in those damn sandals. But they made it back to their packs, then started the long hike down. My sister said the woman got quieter as they descended. Not unconscious, but almost zoned out. Her weight dragged on the more, and her steps got clumsier. She kept muttering about needing to get back, asking if they were near the parking lot, asking if it was still morning. She thought the sun had just come up. My sister didn't correct her anymore. There wasn't any point. They finally reached the bottom by late afternoon. They found a trailhead parking area, and to my sister's surprise, the woman's car was actually there. She looked at the car, then at the woman, who was leaning heavily against a boulder like she might fall asleep on her feet. Still no cell service. My sister decided she couldn't wait any longer. She drove the woman's car herself, the stranger curled up in the passenger seat, soaking through a towel they had in the back. My sister said the inside of the car smelled like dried sweat and wet cotton. The heater barely worked. The woman kept repeating that she didn't need a hospital, said she just wanted to go back to her bed and breakfast. They found it eventually, a little place off a gravel road near the edge of town. When they pulled up, the woman seemed to snap awake. She got out like nothing was wrong, thanked them both, and walked inside. My sister was dumbfounded. She watched her disappear through the front door and just sat there. Eventually, she followed her inside and talked to the owners. She told them they needed to call someone, that the woman wasn't okay, that she'd spent at least one night alone in the snow and didn't even know it. The owners looked alarmed but composed. They said they'd call a medic right away. My sister and her friend waited outside. An ambulance came 20 minutes later. The woman didn't argue. She got in without resistance. My sister didn't follow, just watched them go. She didn't have the energy. The next day, she called the hospital to check in. She was still shaken by the whole thing. They said the woman had been diagnosed with severe hypothermia, low blood pressure, and dehydration. She'd passed out at some point during her hike and had no memory of the night. She thought it had been maybe 3 hours, not almost 20. She was from Chicago, a flatlander, and this had been her first mountain hike. She'd gone alone. No one knew where she was. My sister went to visit her that afternoon. The woman was sitting up, sipping warm broth from a cup. She smiled when she saw my sister. She looked fragile and bruised, but alive. My sister said the whole thing didn't feel real until then. They didn't stay long. The woman thanked her for saving her life. My sister told her it was lucky they heard her, that she was in the right place at the right time. But they both knew it was more than that. They still keep in touch, lightly. A message here and there. Nothing deep. Just two people who crossed paths in a place that doesn't care if you make it or not. When my sister told me all this, she said the scariest part wasn't finding the woman in the snow. It was the moment she realized that woman had no idea how close she came to dying. That she thought she was fine, that her car was uphill, that the night never happened. That's what stuck with her. How easy it was to slip out of reality. How quiet it got when things went wrong. No screaming, no panic, just a faint voice above a creek calling for help. And two girls with a choice to make. They made the right one. That's why the woman is still alive. I was on the way to work, but I was already in the national forest. That sounds strange, I know, but my commute takes me through the back roads that cut deep through the wooded zones of the preserve. I work for the Parks Department, and during the summer months, especially in wildfire season, we rotate patrols early in the morning and again at night. My shift had me reporting to a ranger station tucked way up in the northeast corner of the boundary, hours from the nearest town. It was a Tuesday in late November, and it had been dry and windy for weeks. The road that morning was dust and washboard ruts, the kind that rattles your molars loose no matter how slow you take the turns. I had the windows down because the truck's AC wasn't working, and despite the season, it was already warm by sunrise. I was maybe 45 minutes from the station, still in one of those more remote stretches, surrounded by dense, dry pine with thick underbrush and long sight lines between the trees. I had driven that road a dozen times. Nothing ever stood out. Except that morning, something did. The first odd thing was a set of tire tracks in the dirt that looked fresh, too fresh. Not unusual in itself, but they veered off onto a disused maintenance trail that had been gated for years. The chain link fence across it had been clipped open. I slowed down and rolled to a stop, engine idling. Got out to look. Sure enough, someone had bolt cuttered the lock. The fence was peeled back just enough to let a vehicle squeeze through. I remember feeling irritated more than anything. Trespassers in the forest weren't rare, especially hunters or off-grid types. I radioed it in, but the line was static heavy and I didn't get confirmation. I made a note of it and kept driving. About 10 minutes later, just before the big bend near an old dried creek, I passed through a patch of forest where the trees thinned out. That's when I noticed how quiet it had gotten. The kind of silence you only notice when you realize what's missing: birds, insects, even wind. Nothing moved. Then the smell hit. It was faint at first, then strong and sudden like blood and something else. Wet fur maybe, or rotting meat. I thought it might be a dead animal nearby, possibly something larger like a deer. I slowed down again, looking for signs of a carcass off the road. Nothing. The smell lingered longer than it should have. Then it faded just as quickly as it had come. I made it to the station, clocked in, and started my usual prep, checking maps, fuel levels, reviewing the call log. The only reports in that morning were a controlled burn being monitored 20 miles to the west, and a couple of hikers overdue, but likely just off trail. A little before noon, I went out for my first solo patrol of the day. I took one of the department ATVs out toward an old abandoned campsite that hadn't been used officially in years, but still drew the occasional squatter. I followed a thin dirt trail overgrown with manzanita and black oak, bouncing over roots and ruts. The kind of place that makes you feel like you're farther out than you are. I remember the sun being high and the heat shimmering off the dirt. No shade, no sound. I stopped at the old site, looked around, found a few rusted cans, a burned out fire ring, and some fresh footprints in the dust, boot prints. Heavy tread. Recent. No sign of anyone, though. I figured I'd sweep the loop and maybe run into whoever had been squatting there. Could have been harmless. Could have been a hunter trying to dodge permit fees. As I got farther into the loop, the trail narrowed. The forest closed in tight, like it was folding over the path. That's when I noticed something else strange. Branches snapped high up on the trees, higher than any human could reach. About 7 feet off the ground, clean breaks. Some of them looked fresh. Not animal rubs or claw marks, just snap branches. And they kept showing up every 50 feet or so along the trail like breadcrumbs. I stopped and stood there for a few minutes, listening. Again, nothing. Dead air. No movement. I thought about turning around then, but I didn't. I was curious. I kept going. Eventually, I reached a clearing I didn't recognize from maps. It looked man-made, too symmetrical. The grass was matted down in the middle like something large had been resting there. Nearby, there was a pile of something, sticks maybe, but arranged vertically in a pattern. Not quite a teepee. Not quite natural. I got off the ATV and walked over to it. The pile was mostly dry twigs, interwoven with bits of bark, trash, and what looked like shredded cloth. Old canvas, maybe. A few spots of dark staining on the lower branches. I touched it. Dry but solid. Not recent. Whoever made it had done it with some thought. I took a few pictures and marked the coordinates. Then I heard something heavy move through the brush about 30 yards away. I froze. The sound was slow, one step at a time, deliberate, not panicked or startled like an animal. I couldn't see anything, but I knew something was there. I backed slowly toward the ATV. The hairs on my neck were standing up. It wasn't fear, not at first, just that instinct that something is watching you. Then I heard breathing. Heavy, raspy, like a man out of breath, but deeper. Longer. Not wheezing, more like a slow exhale. And close. I got on the ATV, turned it over, and started back down the trail faster than I should have. I didn't look back. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I even looked up some wildlife reports, tried to convince myself it had been a black bear or even a mountain lion, but the movements were all wrong. And the height of those snapped branches, no bear had arms that long. Still, I didn't report it. I didn't want to be the guy who spooked himself over nothing. The next morning, I took the long way into work again. I had been restless all night and wanted to check that area again in daylight. I parked the truck and hiked in this time, taking it slow. The forest felt different in the morning. Lighter. The smells were back to normal. Birds were chirping. The usual. But when I got to the clearing, the stick pile was gone. Not destroyed, gone. Not a twig left. The grass where it had sat was flattened, like something heavy had dragged it away. There were deep, narrow footprints in the dirt, 2 parallel tracks, long heel-to-toe impressions. Barefoot, but not human. Too long. I measured one against my boot, which is a size 11. The print was at least 15 inches. Narrow, almost canine in the way the front toes were spaced. Not splayed like a bear's. I stood there a long time just looking. My radio was on, but silent. The forest had gone quiet again. No wind, no birds. Then the temperature dropped. It wasn't gradual, it hit like a wave. 1 second I was sweating through my shirt. The next I was shivering. It was easily 20 degrees colder, and I could see my breath fogging in the air. I felt that same static across my skin, like the air was charged. Every hair on my body stood up. And then I smelled it again, that metallic raw scent. Blood and something else. Stronger this time. I backed away, without turning, feeling that heavy gaze again. Nothing moved, but I knew whatever I'd heard the day before was close. Closer than before. I didn't run. I just kept walking until I was out of the clearing. When I finally looked back, there was nothing there. Just trees. But I didn't feel safe again until I was back in the truck, door locked, engine running. I finished my shift like normal. Didn't mention it. Didn't write it up. That night, I called a friend of mine. He used to work on a game reserve in South Africa in the old Orange Free State region. He'd done anti-poaching patrols out in the Bushveld. I remembered him telling me once, years ago, about something they'd seen while on patrol. He never told me the full story back then. I asked him to tell me now. He said they'd been out one night, parked near the edge of a thicket, smoking and cooling off. It was hot, even at night. Then one of the girls with them asked for a jersey. She'd suddenly gotten cold. Strange, he said, because the heat had been stifling. He turned around to grab a jacket from the back of the truck and saw it standing there, in the brush, watching them, over 7 feet tall, long-limbed, eyes reflecting in the brake lights, head shaped like a bush dog. It looked wrong, not like an animal, not like a man, just wrong. He said they all froze, same as I had. Total silence, pure dread, like it wasn't just dangerous, it was evil. It stepped forward once. That was enough. They tore out of there, adrenaline doing all the thinking. He said he'd never seen it again, but he'd never forgotten that moment. I told him what I'd seen, what I'd felt. He went quiet. Then he told me something I haven't stopped thinking about since. He said there are things out there, real things, not spirits, not monsters, real flesh and blood creatures that don't belong. He thinks some of them were seen by ancient people, remembered in myths, drawn on cave walls, things that still walk the bush at night. Maybe once in 1,000 square miles, maybe once in a lifetime, but they're out there. And now I believe him. I went back to that clearing one more time, a week later. Took 2 other rangers with me. We found nothing. The stick structure was still gone. The branches were still snapped high up. But no tracks, no smell. The forest was just a forest again. I haven't been back since. And I've taken a different road to work every day, just in case. I've been a ranger for a while now. I've walked through quiet valleys where the fog moves like it has its own mind. I've been caught in surprise storms that turn dry ground into a pit of sucking mud in under an hour. I've pulled people off cliffs, dug out rolled ankles from the thickest brush you can imagine, and found missing hikers so deep in the backcountry it made no sense how they had even gotten there. But there's one thing that's always stuck with me. It didn't happen while I was working, not officially. It happened years before I put on the uniform, back when I was just a kid. But that was the moment something in me changed, when I started to understand just how fast someone, can disappear out here. And how sometimes, when they come back, you're not sure if they ever really left. I was around 14 at the time, still young enough to follow my dad out hunting without a second thought, but old enough to carry my own rifle and act like I knew what I was doing. My little brother, who was 9 then, had just started coming with us on these short afternoon hunts. It was mid-fall, one of those cold, gray days where you could feel winter waiting just out of sight. The sky had that dull silver look, and the trees were mostly bare already. You could hear every movement for a mile, every step crunching dead leaves, every stick snapping underfoot. We headed out a few hours before sundown. Dad had taken us to a spot he liked a few miles out from the house. The land wasn't marked, but everyone around knew who owned what, and nobody minded us being there. It was thick second-growth woods with pockets of low-lying, swampy stuff between ridges. That fall had been a wet one, flood warnings earlier in the week, and you could feel the sogginess underfoot in the flatter sections. I remember my boots collecting clumps of wet leaves with every step. The kind that stick and suck at your soles until you scrape them off with a stick or a rock. We weren't 20 minutes into the walk when my little brother tugged on my arm. I was ahead of him, following my dad, who was picking a quiet path through a dense stretch of beech and maple, moving careful and slow. My brother just touched my sleeve and looked up at me, real serious. I leaned down a bit, and he said something about seeing someone standing by a tree. I looked where he pointed, but I didn't see anything except trunks and leaves and the slow drift of the wind. I told him it was probably just a shadow or something he imagined. He looked unsure, but let go of my arm and kept walking. I didn't think much of it at the time. We were always seeing shapes in the woods, tree stumps that looked like animals, twisted branches that could be anything at a glance. And kids see things. I saw plenty when I was that age. So we kept going. The trail climbed a bit up onto a dry ridge and flattened out. It was quiet, too quiet, I remember thinking. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel peaceful, but hollow, like all the sound had drained out of the woods. A few minutes passed before I noticed I didn't hear my brother behind me anymore. I paused and looked over my shoulder, expecting him to be there, maybe tying his boot or getting distracted by something. But there was nothing, just empty trail and leaves. I turned back to get my dad's attention, and we both doubled back. We called his name. I walked down the trail again. My dad checked down a little slope to the east, where there was a low, muddy drainage cut between two ridges. No sign. The air felt thick, like the forest was holding its breath. I remember being struck by this sudden cold. Worse than before, deeper. I checked my watch and realized maybe 10 minutes had passed since my brother said he saw that figure. Less than 10 minutes, and he was gone without a sound. My stomach went tight. It's the kind of feeling that doesn't go away, even after you find someone. It just sits in you, knowing how fast something can go wrong. We searched for a good half hour. It felt like longer. I kept replaying things in my head, where he was walking, what he'd said, how far back he might have fallen behind. But the ground wasn't torn up. No broken branches. No real signs of him going off the trail. The only thing I noticed was that the woods to the west seemed a little darker, even though the sun hadn't set yet. The direction dipped down toward a swampy patch I remembered being mostly unwalkable when I'd been there the year before. Thick mud, low trees, lots of bramble. Not a place a kid would wander into on his own, not without yelling or leaving a trail. Then, just as suddenly as he'd vanished, he was there. I heard leaves crunching behind me and turned, and he was walking up from the west like he'd just strolled out for a bathroom break. He wasn't running, not crying, not even talking, just walking like nothing had happened. His clothes were streaked with mud. Nothing heavy, but enough to make it clear he'd been down on the ground. His knees were the worst of it, and his palms were coated too, like he'd fallen or crawled. I ran up to him, checking for scrapes or cuts, but he just stood there looking confused. I don't think he realized how long he'd been gone. I asked him where he'd gone, and he just stared at me like he didn't understand the question. That blank, innocent kind of look kids give when they're not lying, but also not sure what's real. Later on, after he got home, he told me he didn't remember anything. Just saw a doe in the trees and stepped toward it. Next thing he knew, he was walking out of the woods. No memory of falling. No sense of time. Just a gap, like someone had cut the middle out of the tape. We didn't talk about it much after that. My dad shrugged it off, said he probably wandered a little too far and got turned around. It happens, but it didn't sit right with me. Not the way he looked, not the direction he came from, and not that mud. I've been down in those western lowlands before, and I know how nasty they get after rain. You don't just take a few steps and come out with mud only on your knees and hands. You come out drenched, half covered in leaves, maybe with a shoe stuck behind in the muck. And you sure as hell don't walk quietly through that mess. I should have heard him, long before he showed up. Years passed, and I started working in parks and forests myself. I've seen plenty of lost kids and distracted hikers. I've seen what people look like when they've been out of sight for too long, panicked, thirsty, scraped up. But my brother never looked like that. He didn't act like he'd been gone at all. He wasn't scared, wasn't cold, just confused, like he'd blinked and ended up 20 yards from where he started. I've gone back to that area a few times, mostly on my own time, just to walk the ridges and see if anything jumps out at me. One time, a few years ago, I went back after a week of heavy rain. I try to follow the path he would have taken from the west for where we saw him come out. It's worse than I remembered. No real trail, just flooded channels and soggy ground that wants to pull your boots off. I sank past my ankles more than once, and I'm taller and heavier than he was. There's no way he came through there without leaving some kind of mess behind. There's something else too. Every time I've walked that area since, I've gotten this strange feeling like being watched, but not by animals. Not danger exactly, just pressure. Like the air's thicker in that patch of woods. Like sound moves different. I don't stay long. I always end up turning back sooner than I mean to. I've never brought it up with my brother as an adult. He remembers the event, kind of, says he still can't recall where he went. We've talked about it vaguely, like something weird that happened when we were kids, but I can tell it still unsettles him. I think he doesn't want to know the answer. I'm not sure I do either. People think the woods are just trees and animals and dirt, but they're more than that. They're deep in ways we don't understand. They hold things, memories, moments, even people for longer than we expect. Sometimes they give them back. Sometimes they don't. And sometimes, like with my brother, they give them back changed in ways you can't see. You just know. I became a ranger partly because I love the outdoors, but also because I know how fast people can vanish out here. It doesn't take ghosts or monsters. Just a glance the wrong way. A few steps in the wrong direction. The woods close behind you like water, and you're gone. That day shaped who I became. It taught me that not all danger looks like danger. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's soft and strange and slow. Sometimes it looks like your little brother walking out of the woods, covered in mud, smiling like nothing happened. But something did, and I think about it every time I step off the trail. I was on the way to work, but I was already in the national forest. That sounds strange, I know, but my commute takes me through the back roads that cut deep through the wooded zones of the preserve. I work for the Parks Department, and during the summer months, especially in wildfire season, we rotate patrols early in the morning and again at night. My shift had me reporting to a ranger station tucked way up in the northeast corner of the boundary, hours from the nearest town. It was a Tuesday in late November, and it had been dry and windy for weeks. The road that morning was dust and washboard ruts, the kind that rattles your molars loose no matter how slow you take the turns. I had the windows down because the truck's AC wasn't working, and despite the season, it was already warm by sunrise. I was maybe 45 minutes from the station, still in one of those more remote stretches, surrounded by dense, dry pine with thick underbrush and long sight lines between the trees. I had driven that road a dozen times. Nothing ever stood out. Except that morning, something did. The first odd thing was a set of tire tracks in the dirt that looked fresh, too fresh. Not unusual in itself, but they veered off onto a disused maintenance trail that had been gated for years. The chain link fence across it had been clipped open. I slowed down and rolled to a stop, engine idling. Got out to look. Sure enough, someone had bolt cuttered the lock. The fence was peeled back just enough to let a vehicle squeeze through. I remember feeling irritated more than anything. Trespassers in the forest weren't rare, especially hunters or off-grid types. I radioed it in, but the line was static heavy and I didn't get confirmation. I made a note of it and kept driving. About 10 minutes later, just before the big bend, near an old dried creek, I passed through a patch of forest where the trees thinned out. That's when I noticed how quiet it had gotten. The kind of silence you only notice when you realize what's missing: birds, insects, even wind. Nothing moved. Then the smell hit. It was faint at first, then strong and sudden like blood and something else. Wet fur maybe, or rotting meat. I thought it might be a dead animal nearby, possibly something larger like a deer. I slowed down again, looking for signs of a carcass off the road. Nothing. The smell lingered longer than it should have. Then it faded just as quickly as it had come. I made it to the station, clocked in, and started my usual prep, checking maps, fuel levels, reviewing the call log. The only reports in that morning were a control burn being monitored 20 miles to the west and a couple of hikers overdue, but likely just off trail. A little before noon, I went out for my first solo patrol of the day. I took one of the department ATVs out toward an old abandoned campsite that hadn't been used officially in years, but still drew the occasional squatter. I followed a thin dirt trail overgrown with manzanita and black oak, bouncing over roots and ruts. The kind of place that makes you feel like you're farther out than you are. I remember the sun being high and the heat shimmering off the dirt. No shade, no sound. I stopped at the old site, looked around, found a few rusted cans, a burned out fire ring, and some fresh footprints in the dust, boot prints. Heavy tread. Recent. No sign of anyone, though. I figured I'd sweep the loop and maybe run into whoever had been squatting there. Could have been harmless. Could have been a hunter trying to dodge permit fees. As I got farther into the loop, the trail narrowed. The forest closed in tight like it was folding over the path. That's when I noticed something else strange. Branches snapped high up on the trees. Higher than any human could reach. About 7 feet off the ground, clean breaks. Some of them looked fresh. Not animal rubs or claw marks. Just snap branches. And they kept showing up every 50 feet or so along the trail like breadcrumbs. I stopped and stood there for a few minutes, listening. Again, nothing. Dead air. No movement. I thought about turning around then, but I didn't. I was curious. I kept going. Eventually, I reached a clearing I didn't recognize from maps. It looked man-made, too symmetrical. The grass was matted down in the middle like something large had been resting there. Nearby, there was a pile of something, sticks maybe, but arranged vertically in a pattern. Not quite a teepee. Not quite natural. I got off the ATV and walked over to it. The pile was mostly dry twigs, interwoven with bits of bark, trash, and what looked like shredded cloth. Old canvas, maybe a few spots of dark staining on the lower branches. I touched it. Dry but solid. Not recent. Whoever made it had done it with some thought. I took a few pictures and marked the coordinates. Then I heard something heavy move through the brush about 30 yards away. I froze. The sound was slow, one step at a time, deliberate, not panicked or startled like an animal. I couldn't see anything, but I knew something was there. I backed slowly toward the ATV. The hairs on my neck were standing up. It wasn't fear, not at first, just that instinct that something is watching you. Then I heard breathing. Heavy, raspy, like a man out of breath, but deeper. Longer. Not wheezing, more like a slow exhale. And close. I got on the ATV, turned it over, and started back down the trail faster than I should have. I didn't look back. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I even looked up some wildlife reports, tried to convince myself it had been a black bear or even a mountain lion, but the movements were all wrong. And the height of those snapped branches, no bear had arms that long. Still, I didn't report it. I didn't want to be the guy who spooked himself over nothing. The next morning, I took the long way into work again. I had been restless all night and wanted to check that area again in daylight. I parked the truck and hiked in this time, taking it slow. The forest felt different in the morning. Lighter. The smells were back to normal. Birds were chirping. The usual. But when I got to the clearing, the stick pile was gone. Not destroyed, gone. Not a twig left. The grass where it had sat was flattened, like something heavy had dragged it away. There were deep, narrow footprints in the dirt, 2 parallel tracks, long heel-to-toe impressions. Barefoot, but not human. Too long. I measured one against my boot, which is a size 11. The print was at least 15 inches. Narrow, almost canine in the way the front toes were spaced. Not splayed like a bear's. I stood there a long time just looking. My radio was on, but silent. The forest had gone quiet again. No wind. No birds. Then the temperature dropped. It wasn't gradual. It hit like a wave. 1 second I was sweating through my shirt. The next I was shivering. It was easily 20 degrees colder, and I could see my breath fogging in the air. I felt that same static across my skin, like the air was charged. Every hair on my body stood up. And then I smelled it again, that metallic raw scent. Blood and something else. Stronger this time. I backed away without turning, feeling that heavy gaze again. Nothing moved, but I knew whatever I'd heard the day before was close. Closer than before. I didn't run. I just kept walking until I was out of the clearing. When I finally looked back, there was nothing there. Just trees. But I didn't feel safe again until I was back in the truck, door locked, engine running. I finished my shift like normal. Didn't mention it. Didn't write it up. That night, I called a friend of mine. He used to work on a game reserve in South Africa, in the old Orange Free State region. He'd done anti-poaching patrols out in the Bushveld. I remembered him telling me once, years ago, about something they'd seen while on patrol. He never told me the full story back then. I asked him to tell me now. He said they'd been out one night, parked near the edge of a thicket, smoking and cooling off. It was hot, even at night. Then one of the girls with them asked for a jersey. She'd suddenly gotten cold. Strange, he said, because the heat had been stifling. He turned around to grab a jacket from the back of the truck and saw it standing there, in the brush, watching them, over 7 feet tall, long-limbed, eyes reflecting in the brake lights, head shaped like a bush dog. It looked wrong, not like an animal, not like a man, just wrong. He said they all froze, same as I had. Total silence, pure dread, like it wasn't just dangerous, it was evil. It stepped forward once. That was enough. They tore out of there, adrenaline doing all the thinking. He said he'd never seen it again, but he'd never forgotten that moment. I told him what I'd seen, what I'd felt. He went quiet. Then he told me something I haven't stopped thinking about since. He said there are things out there, real things, not spirits, not monsters, real flesh and blood creatures that don't belong. He thinks some of them were seen by ancient people, remembered in myths, drawn on cave walls, things that still walk the bush at night. Maybe once in 1,000 square miles, maybe once in a lifetime, but they're out there. And now I believe him. I went back to that clearing one more time, a week later. Took 2 other rangers with me. We found nothing. The stick structure was still gone. The branches were still snapped high up, but no tracks, no smell. The forest was just a forest again. I haven't been back since, and I've taken a different road to work every day, just in case. I wasn't a park ranger, not officially. I was a historical docent, which basically meant I gave tours and talked to visitors about history at a place called Blennerhassett Island in Parkersburg, West Virginia. I was about 15 at the time, and it was my first summer doing something that felt like real work. It wasn't flipping burgers or babysitting. It felt like I was part of something bigger, wearing the uniform, helping out with tours, setting up for events, learning the names and faces of the Blennerhassett family and the strange history of the island. I even got to ride the Sternwheeler ferry every morning across the river to the island and back in the evening. That ride alone made it all feel more serious, more real. The island has this strange kind of stillness to it. Even when the trees are moving or birds are calling, there's something quiet about the place. The house on the island, the Blennerhassett mansion, had been rebuilt after the original burned down, but even that replica had an eerie quality to it. Too clean, too staged, like a memory you couldn't fully touch. They told us all kinds of stories before we started working, about the family, about Aaron Burr and his strange plot after killing Hamilton, about the ghosts people claimed to see, Margaret in her white gown, Harmon walking the halls, the daughter they called Baby Margaret, the Indian spirit at the southern tip of the island, and the groundskeeper who sometimes showed up around the Putnam Hauser house. Everyone had a story or knew someone who had one, but I didn't think too much about that stuff. I was practical. I liked being outside. I liked working. I liked walking the trails and learning the layout of the island. I liked the weight of the ferry ride and the crunch of gravel under my shoes on the pathways. I liked being alone on my breaks, walking off the main routes and finding the less traveled spots. I always brought a simple lunch, usually a peanut butter sandwich, an apple, and a bottle of water, and I'd sit on a bench out by a clump of trees on the west side of the island, not too far from the visitor center, but hidden enough to feel quiet. The spot wasn't special to anyone but me. It was shaded most of the day, and you could barely hear the voices of visitors or the occasional clink of the blacksmith working near the historic cabins. It was mostly birds and wind. The trees arched overhead and created this natural canopy. There was a wooden bench off the path, old but solid. The paint was peeling in places and some of the bolts were rusted, but it held my weight fine. The first time I found it, it felt like a secret. And that day, the day everything happened, I was heading there again with my lunch in hand, looking forward to some quiet time. It was just past noon. The sun was high, hot and bright, but the shade from the trees made everything look a little dimmer underneath. I walked with my head down, watching my shoes kick little stones out of the way. The gravel crunched underfoot, and the air smelled like dry grass and wormwood. I was thinking about nothing in particular, just hungry, just tired from standing during the morning tours. Out of the corner of my eye, on the edge of the clearing before the bench, I saw something white, just a quick flash of it, the kind of thing where your brain says, that's not part of the landscape. It wasn't the pale bark of a tree or the flutter of a bird's wing. It was too low, too solid. I slowed down without really deciding to. I didn't feel scared, just surprised. I figured maybe one of the other docents had come out here. Some of them wore white aprons over their period clothes, and maybe someone had the same idea for a lunch spot. I looked up to say something, to nod or wave or whatever, and that's when I saw her. A woman in a long, white dress standing just beyond the bench where the trees thickened. She wasn't moving, just standing. Her dress wasn't modern. It had long sleeves, high at the neck, something you'd expect to see in one of the period paintings hung inside the Blennerhassett mansion. It was old-fashioned, detailed, flowing almost to the ground. I couldn't see her face clearly. Her hair was light and pinned up. I stopped walking. My foot froze mid-step. My eyes locked on her. It wasn't just strange, it was wrong. Something about it felt disconnected from everything else. The light around her didn't quite match the rest of the clearing, like she was standing in a separate frame of reality. I blinked, just once, and when I opened my eyes again, she was gone. Completely. No rustle of fabric, no sound of leaves, no footsteps, just nothing. The spot where she'd been standing was empty. I stared at it like the imprint of her should still be there. Some trace, some hint. But there was nothing. Just trees, dirt, and that worn-out bench. I didn't feel the breeze. I didn't feel the heat. Just a flat cold in the center of my chest. I stood there for what felt like a full minute. My mind tried to fill in the blanks. Maybe it had been the light. Maybe a docent had walked past and I hadn't seen them clearly. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe I was more tired than I thought. But none of it fit. I hadn't imagined the details. I hadn't imagined the way the dress moved slightly or how still the figure had been. I'd seen it. Her, standing just beyond the bench like she was waiting for someone. I turned around and walked fast back toward the visitor area. I didn't eat my lunch. I didn't talk to anyone. I just sat near the welcome center behind the garden display and tried to calm myself down. I didn't go back to that bench the rest of the summer. I stuck to the shaded porch of the mansion or the gravel edge by the stables when I wanted to be alone. I never told any of the visitors what I saw, but I did mention it to a few other docents later that day. They laughed it off, said I'd seen Margaret's ghost, that I'd joined the club, but it didn't feel like a ghost story. It didn't feel like a dream or a myth. It felt real, solid, too clear in my mind, like a snapshot I couldn't unsee. I didn't smell lilac like the old stories said. I didn't feel some chilling wind or hear whispers. I didn't feel watched. It was just her, standing, and then not. After that day, I started paying more attention to the quiet, to the way things looked out of the corner of my eye. I'd scan the tree lines, not out of fear exactly, but out of caution. The place didn't scare me, but it unsettled me. The longer I worked on the island, the more I understood why people told the stories they did. Not because they needed to believe in ghosts, but because it gave shape to the strangeness. It gave them a way to talk about the feeling you sometimes got there, that something old was brushing up against the edges of now. A few weeks later, I walked past the path that led to that bench. I didn't mean to. It was just a route I was taking to check on something behind the Putnam Hauser house. But I glanced down the shaded trail, and for a split second, I thought I saw something white again, just a flicker low to the ground. I stopped, hard in my throat. But when I looked directly, there was nothing. After that summer, I didn't go back to Blennerhassett Island. I moved on to other jobs, other places. Life got busy, but every so often, I think about that white dress, about the stillness in the air and the way my breath caught when I blinked and she was gone. I don't try to explain it anymore. I don't try to convince anyone. And I definitely don't call it a ghost. What I saw was a woman in a white dress during the middle of a hot summer day on an island that holds more history in its dirt than most places do in museums. Whether she was real or not, I don't know. But she was there. She stood in that clearing, as clear as anything else I've ever seen. In that moment, those few seconds, have stuck with me longer than anything else I experienced on that island. Maybe it was someone in costume. Maybe someone was pulling a prank. Maybe I had a momentary lapse in vision, or maybe the light played tricks. All those things are possible, but none of them felt true. I know what I saw, and I know how it made me feel. It wasn't fear exactly. It was recognition. That feeling you get when you see something that doesn't belong, but also doesn't leave. That memory lives in the back of my mind, sharper than most others from that time. Sometimes we don't get explanations. Sometimes the clearest things we see are the ones we can't explain. And for me, that day, on that trail, with that bench and shadows and the sun high in the sky, I saw something I'll never forget. Whether or not anyone believes me doesn't change that. It happened. I was there. I saw her. I was 15 this summer. I started working on Blennerhassett Island. I wasn't a park ranger, not in any official way, but I was a historical docent, which basically meant I dressed up in period clothing and led people around the reconstructed mansion and grounds, telling them about the Blennerhassetts and their strange chapter in American history. It was the kind of job that felt like make-believe at first. I wore a hot, layered costume even in July, gave the same rehearsed tour speech 100 times a day, and tried to smile while sweating through my collar. But I liked the rhythm of it. I liked the ferry ride in the morning, the hum of the cicadas around noon, and the calm of the island when the last boat left in the evening. Blennerhassett Island sits right in the Ohio River near Parkersburg, West Virginia. It's thick with trees, grass that grows high at the edges, and walking trails that spider out from the main house like veins. There's a certain kind of quiet on the island that always made me feel like time folded in on itself there. Even on busy days with crowds and kids and horses clopping around the carriage loop, you could still find pockets where it felt like nobody had walked in hours. The kind of quiet that made your own footsteps sound loud. The kind that lets you hear the river gurgling on all sides. The house was the center of everything. A massive white mansion, rebuilt to mirror the original after it burned down in 1811. People said it was haunted. People always said old places were haunted, but most of us just ignored it. There were stories about Margaret Blennerhassett wandering the halls in a white dress, stories about the daughter, baby Margaret, dying tragically young, and something about an old native man always seen at the south end of the island. A few of the other docents claimed they smelled lilac, sometimes in rooms with no flowers. We laughed about it on the ferry rides, but we all knew which places we didn't like being alone in. For me, it was the Putnam Hauser House, the smaller building moved onto the island from Belpre. That place never felt right, even in full daylight. The day it happened wasn't any different at first. Hot, clear sky, the kind that makes your costume feel like a wool blanket wrapped around your ribs. I remember I had the early ferry that day, so I got there before most of the tourists. I helped sweep the front porch of the mansion and prep the tour route. I went through the motions without thinking much. I was tired from the heat, hungry because I hadn't eaten breakfast, and ready to get through the morning stretch. After the first few tours, I checked the time and saw it was nearly noon. I decided to head toward a little grove of trees just off one of the side paths near the edge of the clearing behind the mansion. There was a bench tucked in there that hardly anyone used, and it was usually shaded. I took the gravel path behind the house, walked past the kitchen garden, and veered off where the trees got thicker. The bench was in sight when I saw something white out of the corner of my eye. Quick, not moving, but catching the sun just enough to pop out against the green. At first, I thought it was one of the other docents. Some of the older girls wore light-colored aprons, and it wouldn't have been the first time someone wandered off during lunch. But something felt off about it immediately. The figure wasn't walking or sitting. It was just there, still, half covered by leaves and shadow. I stopped in my tracks. The island wasn't big, but it was big enough that someone could be on the trail ahead or ducked into the woods and not be seen for a while. I stepped forward a few paces, squinting through the leaves, trying to see more than just that white flash. I got about 10 feet closer and saw her clearly. It was a woman standing in the trees. She had long dark hair and wore a white gown, not like the polyester costumes we wore, but something that looked old, handmade, the fabric too soft and thin to be synthetic. She wasn't moving. Her back was to me, her head tilted slightly to one side, like she was listening to something I couldn't hear. I froze again. My first thought was that it was someone playing a joke. Maybe a new hire messing with the stories. But there was something about how still she was, how absolutely still, that made my stomach drop. I blinked. Just once. When I opened my eyes, she was gone. Not gone in the sense of walked away. Gone like she had never been there. No rustling leaves, no footsteps, no shift in the branches. Just empty woods where a second before someone had stood. My heart jumped into my throat. I looked around wildly, even stepped into the tree line a little, but I didn't hear anything. No footsteps retreating, no giggling from behind a trunk. It was dead quiet except for the usual buzz of insects and the slow hiss of wind in the leaves. The bench was still there, looking just as normal as always. My lunch felt heavy in my bag. I didn't sit down. Instead, I turned around and walked straight back the way I came, past the kitchen garden, past the little well, and back up to the front of the house where some of the others were gathered near the stables. I didn't say anything at first. I didn't want to sound stupid, but my hands were shaking and I could feel sweat prickling down my back, even though I hadn't done anything but walk. I stood near them for a while, pretending to check my apron, brushing dust off my skirt, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen or what I thought I'd seen. Eventually, I told one of the others what happened. She didn't believe me, just kind of shrugged and said I probably saw a reflection or someone messing around. But I knew what I saw. I knew I hadn't imagined it. That night after I got home, I didn't say anything to my parents. I showered and laid in bed thinking about the woman, the way she had stood perfectly still, the white of her dress against the green trees, the way she was there 1 second and gone the next. It wasn't the kind of thing that felt made up. It felt sharp and real, like a splinter you can't get out of your skin. I kept going over the details in my head, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light or my imagination, but I couldn't make it fit. I kept working on the island that whole summer and most of the fall, and nothing else like that ever happened again. I avoided that bench for a long time, stuck to eating lunch in the open or near the others. I told myself it was just a weird day, maybe a sunstroke moment or something, but the truth is it didn't feel like that. I wasn't dizzy. I wasn't tired enough to be hallucinating. And I knew the difference between a shadow and a person. I'd spent every day on that island. I knew the way it looked and sounded and smelled. I knew when something didn't belong. Years later, when I was older, I went back as a visitor. The house looked the same. The trees had grown a little thicker in the back, but the bench was still there. I walked the trail slowly, half expecting to feel something, but it was just a normal, warm afternoon. Nothing strange. No figures. Just cicadas and river wind and the hum of time stretching quietly around me. Looking back on it now, I don't think I saw a ghost. I don't think it was anything supernatural. What I do think is that human memory is tricky. It locks things in place in a way that makes them seem clearer than they were. But the way my stomach dropped, the way the air felt thick in my chest, the way she disappeared without a sound, I can't explain that. I don't need to. I know what I saw. I know how real it felt. And I know that whatever happened in those trees was something I'll never forget. Maybe there was someone messing around. Maybe a visitor wandered off in some vintage costume and ran off when they saw me. Maybe I misread a pile of fabric caught in the branches. But whatever the explanation, the fear I felt in that moment was real. It crawled into my skin and stayed there. It didn't need to be a ghost to scare me. It just needed to be something I couldn't explain. Sometimes I still dream about that island. Not the house or the tourists or the costumes. Just the trees. The way the light filtered through the leaves. The way the bench sat like a forgotten thing. And sometimes, just for a second, I see her again. Just standing there. Still. Listening. And I wake up with that same tight feeling in my chest. That same question in my mind. What did I see? I don't think I'll ever know. But I'm okay with that. Because the island kept its secret. And so did I. I was about 15 when I worked as a historical docent on Blennerhassett Island, just off the shore of Parkersburg, West Virginia. It wasn't the kind of job most kids had at that age, but I'd always been interested in history, and my mom had a friend who helped run the tours. She put in a good word for me, and by early summer, I had a volunteer badge, a beige polo shirt, and a name tag with docent printed under my name. Blennerhassett Island had its own rhythm, its own kind of silence. It wasn't truly remote. The island was right there in the middle of the Ohio River, visible from the mainland. But once you stepped off the boat and onto the gravel path leading past the visitor center, everything felt a little detached from the rest of the world. The trees were tall and slow-moving in the wind, the grass neatly trimmed, the air just a little thicker from the river's humidity. On some days, especially when the clouds hung low and the ferry left you behind for a couple hours, you could feel entirely alone on that island. The Blennerhassett Mansion was the main attraction. Rebuilt to match the original structure, it looked out over a wide clearing with symmetrical gardens and a gravel driveway. Inside, the rooms were set up with period-accurate furniture, oil lamps, and framed portraits on the walls. My job was to explain who Margaret and Harmon Blennerhassett were, what Aaron Burr had done there, and walk people through the parlor, the kitchen, the study, and upstairs bedrooms. We were told not to talk about ghosts unless a visitor asked. The stories were well known. Every tour group had one person who mentioned seeing someone in a white dress or smelling lilac, but we were supposed to keep it historical, not paranormal. I was pretty serious about the job, more than most of the other teens. I memorized the family tree, studied the floor plans, even tried to learn how to tie the old cravat they had a replica of in the master bedroom. I felt like I had a place there, even though I was technically just a kid. Most days I stayed on the path, did my rounds, helped clean or sweep the walkways, and ran the occasional errand between buildings. But one afternoon in late July, I remember it clearly. It was hot enough that the air felt like it stuck to your shirt. I decided to take my lunch alone under a cluster of trees off the main loop. There was a wooden bench set back just beyond a fork in the trail that led toward the south end of the island. It wasn't near any buildings or displays, just a shady spot past the edge of the main tourist area. I liked going there when I needed a break, mostly because no one else bothered to walk that far unless they were on the full walking tour, which wasn't running that day. I had a sandwich in a brown paper bag and a bottle of warm root beer I'd forgotten to stick in the cooler. I didn't care. It was quiet, and that was what I wanted. I cut through the grass and gravel and stepped over the root line that marked the tree line. That part of the island was a little more overgrown, with thinner trails and fewer markers. The trees weren't dense, but they clustered together in a way that muffled sounds. The bench was visible from the trail if you knew to look for it, but to most people, it just looked like trees. I reached it and sat down, leaned back, and took the sandwich out of the bag. It was turkey and mustard on plain wheat bread. I remember peeling the corner of the wax paper back and then hearing a dry crunch behind me, like a single footstep on dried leaves. I turned my head, not quickly, just casually. I expected it to be one of the other docents, maybe Carol or Josh coming to sneak a smoke or tease me for eating alone. But instead, just past a patch of young ash trees, I saw a figure. It was a woman. She was wearing white. Not a modern white either. Not like a t-shirt or summer dress. It looked like an old-fashioned gown, like the ones we described on the tours. Long sleeves, high collar, loose but formal. She was standing at an angle, maybe 10 or 15 feet away, not looking at me, but not turned fully away either. Her hands were clasped in front of her, head tilted slightly down. The whole thing happened in about 2 seconds, long enough for me to register that someone was there, long enough to recognize that it wasn't right. I froze. My sandwich stayed in my lap. My first thought wasn't even ghost. It was confusion. No one on the island should have been dressed like that unless they were part of a reenactment. And we didn't have one scheduled that day. The woman wasn't moving. She didn't seem to notice me, which made it even more strange. I blinked, just a normal blink, and she was gone. Not walked away, not moved, gone. I stood up without realizing it. The sandwich dropped onto the bench. I took 2 steps toward the trees and then stopped again. There was no movement, no branches swaying, no footsteps receding. I didn't feel anything strange, just a tight knot in my stomach that hadn't been there before. I didn't know what to think. I stared at the spot for a solid minute, maybe more. Then I turned and walked quickly, not running but fast enough that I had to slow down before getting back onto the gravel path. Back near the mansion, I saw a group of docents standing near the stables. I walked past them and into the small kitchen building where the volunteers took breaks. I didn't say anything for a few minutes. I just sat down and tried to finish my lunch, but my appetite was gone. Eventually, I told one of them what I'd seen. I didn't try to be dramatic. I just said, I think I saw a woman in white out near the south path. They laughed it off, said it was probably one of the staff in costume, or that maybe I imagined it. A couple of them mentioned Margaret, of course, like they always did, but they didn't take it seriously. After that, I stopped going to that bench. I never told visitors what had happened. I stuck to my job. I gave the tours, cleaned the windows, helped fix a display board when one of the posts rotted out. The season ended, and I didn't return the next summer. I got busy with school, other things. Life moved on, but the memory didn't. Over time, I kept going back to that moment. Not obsessively, just quietly. It lived in the background of my thoughts. The woman's posture, her dress, the way she stood perfectly still. I started to pick apart my own memory. Was it a trick of the light? A reenactor? A mannequin being moved? But nothing made sense. There had been no one else on that part of the island. No tour group. No reenactment. No costumed staff wandering through the trees for no reason. Years later, when I was older, I went back to the island with some friends from college. It was part of a road trip, mostly for nostalgia. I didn't tell them what had happened. We took the regular ferry over, walked the mansion tour, and stood outside on the same gravel path. The place looked smaller than I remembered, quieter. We stayed near the visitor center and then took a short walk toward the south end. The bench was still there. Worn, a little warped, but there. I didn't sit on it. I just looked past it toward the trees. There wasn't anything there. No figure. No white dress. Just trees swaying in the wind. Birds calling somewhere in the canopy. The steady sound of water against the far bank of the island. I still don't know what I saw. But here's what I do know. And it's the part that stayed with me the most. Sometimes you see something that doesn't add up. And your brain will want to twist it, explain it, cram it into a neat little box. But some things don't go in boxes. Some things just happen, and they hang there in your memory like a painting you don't quite understand but can't forget. I've never claimed it was a ghost. I'm not that kind of person, but I do know it wasn't normal. It wasn't a shadow or a curtain in the breeze or a misremembered dream. It was real. I was there. I saw it. I blinked and it was gone. And no matter how many years go by, I can still feel the exact air on my skin from that day, can still see the white of her dress against the green of the trees, can still feel the silence that followed like a pressure in the air. It wasn't terrifying in the scream and run sense, but it was something else. It was a deep, unsettling quiet, the kind that seeps into you like damp through shoes. The kind that doesn't shout, it just stays. That was the last summer I ever worked on the island. But every once in a while, if I'm near Parkersburg, or if someone brings up the name Blennerhassett, I find myself thinking about that bench again, and about the woman who never looked at me, but stood just long enough to be seen. And whether she was there or not doesn't really matter anymore, because for me, she was. I was on my way to work that morning, same as I'd done 100 times before, driving through the national forest on one of the back roads I liked to take when I had the time. It wasn't the fastest route to the station, but it was quiet and pretty, and I'd gotten into the habit of taking it when I wasn't in a rush. The road was dirt, with loose gravel and some stretches and deep ruts from trucks and rain, and it wound through thick stands of pine and fir, with long blind corners and low dips that sometimes held onto the last of the fog, even past mid-morning. It was around 7:30 a.m., early enough that the sun was still filtering sideways through the trees, that bright slant of morning light you get in summer. I had a thermos of coffee between my legs, and the radio turned low. I wasn't expecting anything unusual. The forest looked like it always did, quiet, damp from the night air, birds just starting to move around. Then I saw the smoke. It was just a thin plume at first, off in the distance, right up the road, maybe a quarter mile ahead. At first I thought it might just be morning mist catching light weird, but as I got closer I could tell by the color and the movement, it was too dense and it was rising in that thick, twisting way that means heat. The smell hit next. Not a campfire or a structure burn, but that sharp, acrid stink of burning rubber and plastic. Something synthetic. I slowed down, eased around one of those blind corners, and that's when I saw it. A van, parked right in the middle of the road, totally engulfed in flames. It was a big one, an old conversion van with those long side panels and curtains in the windows. White, or it had been white, but now it was more black and orange with the fire chewing through every inch of it. The tires had melted down to nothing. The windows were blown out. The heat shimmer off, it was strong enough that I could feel it from inside the cab of my truck. It looked like it had been burning for a while, not just a couple minutes. There was nothing natural about it. The fire hadn't started from a crash. The van was parked, squared off to the middle of the road like someone had stopped there on purpose. I sat there for maybe 30 seconds, watching it burn, trying to make sense of it. My first thought was that someone had ditched a stolen vehicle and lit it to get rid of evidence, or maybe kids messing around, though that didn't quite fit the time or place. There was no one else around. No other cars, no tracks, nothing. I didn't see anyone running from the scene, no shadows in the trees, no movement at all except the flames. I picked up the radio, but realized cell would be faster, so I used my personal phone to call 911 and report it. Told them I'd come across a vehicle fire, middle of Road 16C, near the junction with 421, no signs of injuries that I could tell, road completely blocked. Dispatch took the report and said fire crews would be sent out. I didn't stay. I couldn't get around it, and the road was too narrow to safely try driving past, so I turned around and took the long loop around. Added about 30 minutes to my commute. The rest of the day went by pretty normal. I didn't think much more about the van until later that night, when one of the guys from the sheriff's department called me. They got on scene not long after the fire was reported, but by then the vehicle had burned all the way down. Just a black shell sitting in the road. Fire crews got it under control fast enough, didn't spread to the trees, thankfully. But there had been a body in the driver's seat. I didn't process it at first. I mean, they said it plain. Human remains found inside. Driver's seat. Couldn't be identified visually, but they were working on dental and DNA. It wasn't something I had considered. Not seriously. I'd seen a lot of abandoned vehicles out here. People dump them all the time when they're stolen or trashed. Setting them on fire wasn't that unusual either. The idea that someone had been inside, though, that stuck with me. They ruled it a suicide. That was the official story. Apparently, the guy had left some kind of note at his house, which was nowhere near where the van had been found. He'd driven all the way out into the woods, parked in the middle of that road, and lit himself on fire. I think about it a lot, probably more than I should. I keep trying to make sense of it. The fire itself, the position of the van, the timing. Everything about it just feels off. If someone was going to kill themselves, why drive all the way out into the forest to do it? And not just off to the side, either. He'd parked square in the middle of a service road. Not a major one, but not a hidden trail either. Plenty of people used it. He had to know someone would come along eventually, maybe while the fire was still burning. Maybe even before it started. Why not just drive off a cliff or do it home? It wasn't like he was trying to make a statement or be found. There was no drama to it, no attention seeking. Just a fire in the middle of nowhere. And how do you even do it? I've thought about that part more than I want to admit. What accelerants do you use? How do you get the fire going fast enough that you don't back out at the last second? What kind of mindset do you have to be in to sit there and let it happen? I've seen a lot of grim things working in the forest. Overdoses, accidents, even suicides, but never anything like that. Never something that violent. That committed. I remember replaying it in my head later that week, wondering if I missed something. If there was a detail I should have picked up on, a clue I overlooked. But I keep coming back to the same facts. The van was already fully engulfed when I got there. No signs of anyone moving around, no motion inside, no noise. If there was someone in that driver's seat, they were already gone. And I didn't check. That's what sits with me the most. I didn't stop and check, but I don't feel guilty about it. Not really. I've gone over the timing again and again. That van had been burning for a while by the time I showed up. There's no way anyone could have survived it. If I tried to get close, I probably would have hurt myself. It wasn't a hesitation thing. It was just too far gone. Still, the whole thing left a mark. I avoid that road now, even though I used to like it. There's nothing left there to see. Fire crews cleaned up the wreck, and the sheriff's office handled the investigation. Nothing remains of the van, not even scorch marks. But every time I think about taking that shortcut again, I remember the shape of it through the flames, the way the heat shimmered, off the metal. The silence of it all, and it just doesn't sit right. I've read the reports. I've looked at the pictures. The guy had no history of mental illness, no criminal record, lived alone, worked a steady job. People who knew him said he was quiet but normal. The note he left was vague, almost generic. No explanation, no anger, just a decision. Like he'd picked a day, picked a spot, and followed through. But why there? That road isn't far enough out to be remote, but it's not near anything either. He had to have known it'd take someone a while to find him, and the fire didn't spread. It was just a van, contained, purposeful. I think about how deliberate it all felt. I think that's what unsettles me most. It wasn't like he lost control of the vehicle or made a rash choice. Everything about it was so careful, like it had been thought through in a way that made it feel worse. Not panicked, not messy, just final. That's the thing that stays with me. The stillness of it. The way it looked sitting there, just burning, no sound except the fire, nothing moving. I've come across plenty of death in this job, and it always carries some kind of energy with it. Grief, confusion, fear. But this felt like it didn't want to be understood. I don't talk about it much. I never wrote a report because it wasn't mine to report. I wasn't first on scene. I wasn't involved in the investigation. I just happened to pass by at the wrong, or maybe right time, but I can't stop running it over in my head. The image of it, that black silhouette of the van burning in the early morning light. The smell, the heat, the way it made no sense. There's nothing else to add. No twist, no deeper meaning. Just a quiet road, a man I never met, and a fire I wish I hadn't seen. That's all. That's the whole story. And I don't think I'll ever stop thinking about it. I've worked as a park ranger for almost 12 years now, mostly in the Pacific Northwest. My job's taken me through every kind of terrain you can imagine. Thick forests where the sun barely breaks through, rocky alpine passes, swampy lowlands, and long-forgotten trails winding through land no one's walked in decades. I've seen mountain lions stalk from tree lines, watched storms sweep in from the ocean like dark rolling fists, and help people lost and nearly dead from exposure. Most days it's a good job, quiet, peaceful, but there are days I still think about when I lie awake at night, wondering if I really handled things the way I should have. One of those days was the tail end of summer, 3 years ago. That season had been dry, not just regular dry, but drought-level dry. Springs that usually flowed down the mountains had slowed to a trickle. Wildlife was moving differently, bears coming lower, deer pushing closer to people, looking for water. Fire risk was high. Every day, we checked reports, updated maps, and warned hikers to avoid cooking fires or smoking in the brush. But some people never listen. And that summer, the crowds were huge. Everyone wanted to be outside after being cooped up so long. I was assigned to a remote section of the range, north of a place we called Whiskey Ridge. It's not marked on maps you'd buy at a gas station, but anyone who's worked long enough out there knows it. It's steep, and the trees grow so thick in parts you have to squeeze through sideways. Some of the rock ledges along the trails can be deadly if you misstep. It's not the sort of place people usually hike into unless they know what they're doing. But people do it anyway. Some hear rumors, hidden views, no crowds, that sort of thing, and decide it's worth the risk. Others just get lost. My job that day was to check trail cams we'd placed after a few incidents the previous year. There'd been reports of rock slides and an injury the season before. So I had to hike up the ridge, check the cams, make sure the trails were clear, and head back before dark. I left early, around 5:30 in the morning. The air was already warm, but not too bad. I had a day pack with food, water, a satellite radio, my first aid kit, GPS, and a laminated map. I was maybe 4 hours into the hike when I noticed the first thing that didn't sit right with me. About 3/4 up the ridge, there's a split in the trail. Left takes you to a higher overlook, right slopes down toward a box canyon that's dry most of the year. I always take the left trail first. It gives me a view over the area I'm patrolling, and the cams are easier to reach from there. But when I got to the fork, I saw something strange, boot prints. They were deep, meaning whoever made them was carrying a lot of weight, and they look fresh. The soil in that area is dry and dusty, but these prints had clean edges, less than a day old. I knelt down and studied them for a minute. They headed up the left trail, the same one I was taking. That wasn't a huge deal on its own. We get hikers out here sometimes, but these tracks weren't made by regular hiking boots. They looked like military-style combat boots, heavy tread. Not typical gear for your weekend outdoorsman. I moved on. I figured it was someone ex-military or just someone with odd taste in boots. But I kept looking for more signs as I walked. Broken branches, disturbed moss, things knocked over. The trail narrowed as I climbed. Birds were quiet, more than usual. After a while, I saw the first cam mounted on a tree ahead. It was intact, lens clean. I marked its location, pulled the memory card, replaced it with a new one, and kept going. By noon, I'd made it to the overlook. You can see all the way to the river valley from up there. Usually it's beautiful. This time it felt wrong. Maybe it was the heat, dry wind blowing across the ridge, buzzing in the brush, but I felt watched. The kind of feeling you get when you know someone's standing behind you, only there's no one there. I ate a protein bar, drank water, and went back down to the second trail, the one leading toward the canyon. I figured I'd check the rest of the cams, loop through the canyon trail, and head back. About 15 minutes down the trail, I found the second thing that set me off. It was a pack, just sitting there beside the trail. Big, old external frame type like the ones used back in the 80s. Faded olive green. It looked beat up, worn leather straps, a rusted canteen clipped to the side. I stopped and looked around. No one in sight. I called out. Nothing. I didn't want to touch it, but I needed to make sure someone wasn't hurt nearby. I opened the top. Inside was a bunch of strange gear. Metal tools wrapped in cloth, a spool of thick wire, what looked like part of a ham radio setup, and a pile of papers. I couldn't make sense of the papers at first. Hand-drawn maps, mostly. Some notes, written in blocky handwriting. Coordinates. Numbers. Not trail maps either. These were sketches of terrain, valleys, drainage lines, elevation notes. Whoever made these knew the land better than most people I'd worked with. One page stood out. It was a sketched map of Whiskey Ridge with an X marked in the canyon area and the word vent written next to it. Just that. No other explanation. I stood there for a while, holding the paper. The wind was rising, kicking dust off the trail. I kept scanning the trees, expecting someone to walk up and ask what I was doing with their pack. But no one came. I put the papers back, zipped it up, and marked the spot on my GPS. I planned to report later. Probably just an abandoned pack. Happens sometimes. People get spooked, ditch their gear, head out lighter. Still, something about it didn't sit right. I moved on down the trail. The brush got denser the farther I went. I had to duck under low branches and skirt around deadfall. Around 3 p.m., I reached the last cam near the canyon edge. It was about 20 feet up a tree, mounted to avoid tampering. I climbed up, popped the memory card, and froze. Down below, maybe 50 yards off the trail, was what looked like a camp. I stayed in the tree, watching. The camp was hidden well, tarp strung between trees, brown and green camo. Hard to see unless you were right above it. There was movement down there. A man, tall, stocky, wearing dark clothes. Couldn't see much detail, but he was digging. I watched him for maybe a minute. He never looked up. Then I climbed down as quiet as I could. I backed off the trail and crouched behind some brush. I watched for another 15 minutes. The man kept digging. Eventually, he stepped away, wiped his face, and sat on a log. I could just make out something shiny in the hole, metal. I didn't get a good look. He seemed calm, methodical. This wasn't someone panicking or hiding. He was working, like he'd done this before. I didn't want to confront him alone, so I marked the location on GPS, backtracked a bit, and found a high point where I had satellite radio coverage. I called it in, gave my location, described the pack, the camp, the guy, everything. They told me to stay out of sight and wait for backup, which would take about 4 hours to reach me on foot. I found a spot up high, about 200 yards from the camp, and waited. I watched through binoculars. The man kept digging for another hour, then hauled something out of the hole. It was a box, military style, looked heavy. He popped it open, pulled out what looked like a metal cylinder, inspected it, then carefully repacked it. That's when I realized what this probably was, an old Cold War cache. The park used to border some federal land decades ago, and there were rumors that during the 60s, the government buried supplies in case of invasion. survival bunkers, supply drops, stuff like that. Most were cleared out or forgotten. But if someone found coordinates or records from those times, they might come looking. And it looked like this guy had found one. Problem was, this cache was on protected land. Whatever was inside, he wasn't supposed to have it. And he sure as hell wasn't supposed to be digging it up and leaving traps. I noticed wires strung between trees now, maybe for alarms or worse. This wasn't just someone curious. This was someone operating like he didn't want to be found. By the time backup arrived, the sun was low. 3 other rangers, armed and careful, moved in with me guiding. But the camp was empty by the time we reached it. The hole had been filled. The box was gone. So was the man. We searched until nightfall, found tracks leading down through the dry wash, but they scattered in rocky terrain. No sign of the cache or the man. Back at the station, I handed over the pack, the maps, the notes. Investigators took over. We never found him, never saw him again. They believe he might have been ex-military, someone who found old documentation or heard stories from a family member. Maybe he'd been searching for years, and maybe he finally found what he was looking for and vanished with it. To this day, I think about that ridge. The way it went quiet. The way the man worked, unhurried, like he had all the time in the world. I don't go back to that trail anymore unless I have to. And when I do, I carry more than just my usual kit. Sometimes the scariest things in the wild aren't animals or storms or getting lost. Sometimes it's the people who know how to move without being seen, who know how to disappear, and who are doing things you'll never fully understand. And the worst part? They might be standing just a few trees away, listening, waiting for you to move on. I worked as a park ranger in the northern stretch of Montana for a little over 9 years. Most of my time was spent in Bear Creek Wilderness, a rarely visited corner of the forest known for its deep canyons, cold rivers, and stretches of dense pine. It's not the kind of place that draws crowds, and that's exactly why I liked it. People who came up this way were usually looking to be alone, and I respected that. There are no wide roads, no tourist signs, no easy access points. You had to hike or drive rough fire trails to get in. The terrain was steep, and phone reception dropped off the minute you passed the last gas station. The job mostly involved patrolling trails, maintaining backcountry campsites, and making sure no one got themselves killed. It was early September when things started feeling off. The nights had just started to turn cold, and the animals were moving more, prepping for the winter. The area I patrolled was mostly quiet then. We didn't get hunters that early, and backpackers had mostly cleared out by the end of August. I was staying in one of the cabins near the southern boundary, about 8 miles from Bear Creek proper. That part of the forest had always felt a bit strange to me. Not in a supernatural way, just uneasy. Too quiet sometimes. You'd walk through a stretch of trees and realize you hadn't heard a bird or squirrel for hours. The air always smelled like wet bark and iron. Not a bad smell, but sharp, like something had been scraped open. That week, I had been tracking reports from another ranger who said someone had cut a trail through one of the restricted areas by the creek. That part was marked off for natural restoration. A slide had taken out a hillside a few years earlier, and the soil was still fragile. The idea that someone would cut through it anyway pissed me off. Most people respected closures. If someone had gone through and caused damage, I had to know about it. So I planned a 3-day loop through the region, checking game cams, looking for footprints, and seeing if any signs of people showed up. The first day was uneventful. I hiked about 7 miles north along a ridge that overlooked the creek basin. The trail was thin, winding through thick lodgepole pine and pockets of old cedar. In some spots, I had to push branches out of the way just to keep moving forward. I stopped by a trail camera near an old elk rub, checked the card, and swapped the batteries. The photos just showed a couple of deer from earlier that week, and one blurry shape I couldn't identify, probably a bear or coyote. I kept moving, set up camp at a clearing, and made dinner over the stove. No fire, too dry. It was the second day when things started to go wrong. I woke up around 5:30. The sun hadn't fully come up yet, but there was enough light to pack up and get going. My plan was to descend into the creek basin, hike west along the slope, and cut across to an old game trail that followed the creek bed. I had gone that way once before, about 3 years earlier and remembered it being tricky. Lots of scree and narrow ledges. I wanted to get to the flagged-off zone by late afternoon. About halfway down the slope, I found something odd, a piece of orange flagging tape tied around a sapling. It was fresh. The knot was tight, the tape not yet frayed by wind or rain. That was strange. We hadn't used tape on that part of the forest in over 2 years. I crouched to get a better look and noticed another strip about 30 yards ahead, tied to a branch, and another beyond that. Someone had marked a path. I followed the tape. It snaked down the slope in a zigzag, cutting right through the area we had closed off. The ground here was unstable, loose shale and exposed roots from old slides. Following the tape took effort. I slipped twice, catching myself with my hands on wet stone. The air was colder here too, even though the sun was now out. The trees were packed tighter, and the light filtered through in long gray beams. After maybe an hour of careful movement, I reached the bottom of the slope where the creek bed widened. There, I found a first real sign that something was wrong. A shovel, just a plain metal shovel with a yellow fiberglass handle, leaned up against a tree. It was muddy, not fresh, but used. I scanned the area. No tracks. The ground here was mostly rock and dry leaves. Then I spotted the disturbed soil. A few feet from the base of a cedar tree, the forest floor looked wrong. Flattened, compressed. The moss had been peeled back and laid to the side. I walked over slowly, crouched, and scraped at the dirt with my glove. Someone had dug here. Recently. My heart started to thump. I didn't have a weapon beyond my sidearm and a flare, but I didn't think I needed one. Not yet. I took a few pictures, marked the location on my GPS, and began clearing away the loose dirt. It was shallow, maybe 18 inches down, when I found the edge of tarp. Blue, weathered, but still solid. My breath caught. I pulled it up slowly, peeling back one corner. Inside was a black trash bag, tied tight. I didn't open it. The smell came first, a thick, sour stench that hit the back of my throat and made my eyes water. Rot. I backed away and almost threw up. I knew that smell. Dead animal. Maybe human. I didn't stick around to guess. I reburied the site as best I could, snapped more pictures, and hiked out of the creek bed fast. I went uphill until I got a few bars of reception and called it in. The next 24 hours were a blur. I hiked out to the service road, met with the sheriff's office, and guided a small team back to the burial site. They exhumed the bag. Inside were bones. Human. Not whole. Partial remains, wrapped in layers of plastic and fabric. The medical examiner guessed they'd been buried for less than 6 months. No ID, no clothing, just bone and fragments of what might have been a sleeping bag. Forensics took over. The area was locked down. I answered questions, gave my report, and drove home that night feeling empty. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. 2 days later, I got a call from the sheriff's office. They found something else, something odd, about 30 yards from the burial site. Another disturbed patch of earth. This time, the remains weren't in a bag. They were scattered. Small bones. Not human, but clean. Picked. Arranged in a circle. No sign of wildlife activity. No tracks. Just bones laid out with care. That sat wrong with everyone. Animals don't do that. People do. I didn't sleep much that week. A few days later, I got permission to pull the SD card from the nearest game camera. It was about 400 yards upslope from the burial site. The photos were grainy, taken at night, triggered by motion. One set caught my attention, time-stamped at 2:13 a.m., 2 weeks before I found a shovel. The figure was hard to make out. Tall, wearing dark clothes, carrying something on one shoulder. A bag? A tarp? It was blurry, but the shape looked off, long arms, something dragging behind him. The next photo showed the figure looking straight at the camera, just standing there, not moving, not blinking. A pale face caught in the infrared flash, washed out and featureless, like a mannequin. The final photo showed nothing, just trees. That camera had recorded nothing else for 10 days after that. It had power. It was working, but no movement was recorded. I tried to forget about it, try to focus on my job. But my next patrol took me back to the same region, different trail, different mission. This time, I carried more gear. A second sidearm, extra batteries. A personal locator beacon. I didn't sleep in a tent either. I rigged up a hammock between trees and kept a motion sensor nearby. 3 nights in, I woke up to the sound of something moving through the trees. Not running, not crashing, just moving. Steady, slow, 1 foot at a time. It circled my camp twice. I laid still, not breathing. The motion sensor stayed silent. Nothing triggered it, but I heard the footsteps. I know I did. Pine needles don't crunch like that unless there's weight. I waited until dawn, packed up, and hiked out early. I didn't file a report. There was nothing to say, nothing provable. Over the next few months, more remains were found. One about 3 miles west of the first site. Another buried in a hollowed stump near a trail junction. Always partial, always wrapped in tarp or plastic. Forensics eventually ID'd 2 of them. Both were missing persons from out of state. One had been reported missing 4 years earlier. The other, 7 months. The official story became what you'd expect. Serial killer, using remote wilderness as a dump site. But we never caught anyone. No one was seen. No local suspects. Nothing. The sheriff's office put out statements. The FBI got involved. I gave more interviews than I wanted. And still there was nothing solid. No arrests. No further evidence. Just bones, bags, and silence. The trails around Bear Creek were closed that winter. I didn't go back. I transferred stations the next spring, requested a post in the flatter eastern part of the state. Wide grasslands, open space. You can see everything out there. No trees to hide in. I think about that burial site more than I want to. I think about the face on that camera and the footsteps that didn't trigger the sensor. I remind myself that people are the scariest part of the wilderness. Not ghosts, not monsters, just other people, hiding where no one looked. I've been working as a park ranger for close to 17 years now. In that time, I've seen just about everything a person could see in the woods. Bears, mountain lions, people doing dumb things, search and rescue missions that go well and ones that don't. But nothing sticks with me like what happened in the fall of 2019 when I was stationed out in a lesser-known stretch of forest in northern Washington. This particular area, known officially as Section 12B of Blackroot National Forest, isn't marked on most public maps. It's not a secret, per se, but the trails out there aren't maintained for tourists. There are no brochures, no guided hikes, no posted trailheads. Most of the people who know about it are other rangers or hunters who like their solitude. My job that season was to keep an eye on the area, mainly looking out for illegal campsites, poachers, and making sure nobody got lost. I stayed in a remote ranger station about 12 miles from the closest town. The cabin was basic but fine: a cot, a propane stove, a radio, a logbook, and a stack of field maps. I had a 4-wheeler for longer patrols, but most of the time I went on foot with my pack, GPS, and a week's worth of supplies. There's something about being out in the woods alone like that clears your head. You notice everything. The way the trees move, the smell of wet leaves, the sounds that don't belong. It started with a missing person report. A man named Wesley Grant, 47, had come out here with his dog for a solo trip. His wife reported him missing after he didn't check in. His last known location pinged from a GPS beacon he'd rented, which placed him about 5 miles northwest of my station. I got the call to check it out. I set off just after sunrise the next day. The hike out there wasn't hard, just long and thick with brush. About 2 hours in, I found signs of his camp. Ashes from a fire, a half-eaten pack of trail mix, and the kind of fold-out chair you see at tailgates. But no sign of the man or the dog. I marked the site with orange tape and noted the GPS coordinates. I didn't see any signs of struggle. No blood, no torn clothes. But something was off. The fire was burned low, like it had been left unattended. The chair had been knocked over. The food bag was torn, not cut. I spent the rest of the day sweeping the area in a grid, calling out, looking for any trace. It rained lightly that afternoon, just enough to ruin any clear tracks. I set up a base camp nearby and stayed overnight. That night, I heard something. At around 3 a.m., I woke up to a sound I couldn't place. It wasn't an animal, not a bear or deer. It sounded like something large moving through thick underbrush, slow, and heavy. It wasn't running, but it was deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peer out. Nothing, just fog and trees. I held my breath. The sound had stopped. I waited there for at least 10 minutes, not daring to move. Eventually, I zipped the tent closed and kept the light off. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I expanded the search. About a quarter mile from the original campsite, I found the dog. It was a large golden retriever, laying motionless against a tree. There were no wounds, no signs of trauma. Its body was stiff, like it had died at least a day earlier. I checked for a collar, found a tag that read Rusty. I radioed it in and flagged the location. No sign of Wesley, though. The weird part was the area itself. Everything fell off. The air was still, like before a storm. I didn't hear birds. No squiddies, no insects. Just this odd pressure, like being underwater. I know how that sounds, but that's the only way to describe it. I kept searching. Another day went by, then another. On day 3, I found a trail. Not a man-made one, just a narrow game path heading east. I followed it for maybe a mile. That's when I saw it. Some kind of structure. Not a cabin, not a shack. It looked almost like a hunting blind, made from lashed branches and bark. It had been there a while. The wood was dry and dark with age. Inside, I found bones. Animal bones, mostly. Some deer, maybe a raccoon or two. But there were also human remains, part of a jaw, a femur, a few ribs. They were old, brittle, not fresh. I stepped back and felt a cold sweat run down my back. I took photos and recorded GPS data. The rest of that day was a blur. I was too shaken to keep searching. I hiked back to base and filed my report. That night, I slept at my station with the lights on and the door locked. Search and rescue came in the next day. I led them back to the site. They brought cadaver dogs and more gear. They swept the area for a week and found more bones, some clearly human, others too damaged to tell. No ID, no Wesley. The case was eventually closed as unsolved disappearance. His wife moved away a few months later. I never found out what really happened. Here's the thing, though. I went back once about 6 months later. Not as a ranger, just out of curiosity. I followed the same trail, back to the same area. But the blind was gone. Not just broken or collapsed. Gone like it was never there. No bones, no trafe. Just trees. I don't tell this story often. Not because I'm scared people won't believe me, but because I still don't know what to believe myself. There was no ghost. No monster. No fairitale. Just something wrong. Something that doesn't fit. That's the scariest part. We expect danger to have a face, to roar or scream. But sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's just silence in the woods, a dead dog with no wounds, a structure that disappears. I still work as a ranger. I still go out there alone. But I don't go back to Section 12B. Not anymore. It was the second week of October when I got transferred to a remote outpost in the northern edge of the park. Most people don't know about this place unless they've spent a lot of time hiking or doing backcountry work. There are no paved roads out there, just logging trails and old ranger tracks that weave through thick pine forests and across sharp, rocky hills. The place was about 70 miles from the main ranger station, and I was supposed to be out there for 3 weeks, mostly doing fire watch, checking water sources, and making sure poachers weren't creeping in. The outpost itself was a weathered cabin, about the size of a 2-car garage. No electricity, no running water. A radio was the only way to call in, and it barely worked unless you stood on a certain rock outside and held the antenna in just the right way. I brought everything I need: canned food, water drums, spare clothes, a rifle, my journal, and a lot of batteries for my flashlight. The first few days were uneventful. Quiet, just like I expected. I'd wake up around sunrise, make coffee over the propane burner, then spend the rest of the day hiking through my assigned section. I was keeping an eye out for signs of fire, smoke, scorched patches, anything strange. Nights were calm, but cold. I'd sometimes hear coyotes yipping out in the hills, maybe the distant hoot of an owl. That's about it. On the 5th day, I found something odd. I was hiking about 4 miles northeast of the cabin, near a place marked Dead Man's Ravine on the old maps. The name came from a logging accident decades ago. A man had fallen down a steep drop and broke his neck. They never recovered the body, or so the story went. That part didn't bother me. I've seen worse. The area around the ravine was dry and cracked, like the rest of the region that year. We hadn't gotten rain in weeks. But when I got closer to the ravine itself, I noticed that the ground was damp. Not muddy exactly, but dark, like it had just rained there. I crouched down and ran my fingers over the dirt. It was cool. Damp. I looked up. No clouds. No puddles. No streams or springs nearby. I stood there a moment, confused. It didn't make sense. Then I saw the prints. They weren't boot prints or animal tracks. They looked human, barefoot but large. Bigger than mine, and I wear a size 12 boot. And wide. The toes were splayed like someone with flat feet, or maybe someone who hadn't worn shoes in a long time. The prints led away from the damp spot and down toward the ravine. I followed. The trail was uneven, rocky, and steep. I slipped more than once. About 50 feet down, I found the end of the tracks. Or more like I lost them. They just vanished. No drag marks, no disturbance in the dirt, nothing. I spent a good half hour circling the area, trying to find where they continued. No luck. I started climbing back up, frustrated, but as I reached the top, I noticed a faint, rotten smell in the air, like roadkill that had been sitting in the sun. I checked my pack to make sure nothing had leaked. Nothing had. I sniffed the air again, definitely coming from the ravine. I couldn't see anything dead, but the stench lingered all the way back to the cabin. I wrote it off as a dead animal and logged it in my report that night. Maybe a bear dragged something down there and left it. Happens all the time. The next day, I went back with my rifle. It's not park policy to shoot unless there's a threat, but something about those prints bugged me. People aren't supposed to be out there barefoot, especially not during hunting season. I figured maybe I'd find a lost hiker, or some crazy survivalist squatting in the woods. It wouldn't be the first time. This time, I circled around the ravine from the opposite side, moving slow and watching the ground. After about an hour of searching, I spotted something half buried near the edge. It was a backpack, canvas, old, faded green, covered in dirt and pine needles. I pulled it out and opened it. Inside were a few moldy protein bars, an empty water bottle, a rusted folding knife, and a weather-beaten notebook. The name on the inside cover was David K. No last name, no date. I flipped through it. Most of the pages were too damaged to read, but some of the writing was still legible. Weird, rambling notes. Stuff like, I can hear them moving at night. It's not animals. Something is in the ravine. Something big. I found bones. They weren't animals. Don't go near the cave. That last one made my stomach twist. I looked around. No cave in sight. But I hadn't climbed all the way down the ravine yet. I kept moving, slower now, every sense on alert. After about 20 more minutes of zigzagging across the ravine wall, I found it. A narrow crack in the rock face, partially hidden behind a thicket of brush and dead branches. Not a full cave, more like a slit in the hillside, maybe 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall. It looked unnatural, like it had been split open. The smell hit me again, stronger now, thick. I stood at the entrance and peered inside with my flashlight. The beam lit up about 10 feet of tunnel before vanishing into darkness. The walls were jagged, wet, covered in what looked like moss or maybe mold. I didn't want to go in, but I knew I had to. I took 2 steps inside, rifle in one hand, flashlight in the other. The air was damp and cold. My boots squished on the soft, slimy floor. There were bones scattered near the entrance. Animal bones, mostly. Deer, rabbit, some smaller stuff. All clean, like something had gnawed them down to the marrow. I took another step in. Then I heard breathing. Not mine. It was low and wet, like someone sucking air through a blocked nose. I froze. My flashlight flicked for a second, then steadied. I scanned the tunnel ahead. Nothing. I slowly backed out, every hair on my neck standing up. The breathing didn't follow. It just stopped. I climbed out of the ravine and went straight back to the cabin. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the dark, rifle on my lap, staring at the door. Next morning, I called it in. The radio crackled like usual, but I got through. I told them I found a possible illegal camp, possibly a missing person, and that I wanted backup. They said they'd send 2 rangers up from the main station. It'd take them 2 days to reach me. So I waited. That night, I heard something outside the cabin. It was just after midnight. No wind, no animals, dead quiet. Then a slow, steady thud on the wooden porch, like someone putting down a heavy foot. Then another. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I aimed a rifle at the door, finger on the trigger. The footsteps stopped. No knock, no voice, just silence. After a full minute, I crept to the window and peeked through the edge of the curtain. Nothing, but I saw footprints in the dirt outside. Barefoot, big, the same ones I'd seen near the ravine. I stayed awake until sunrise, then went outside and followed the tracks. They led into the woods, looping around the cabin, then off toward the ridge. After about 200 yards, they vanished, just like before. By the time the other rangers arrived, I was worn thin. I took them to the ravine, showed them the backpack, the notebook, the cave. We didn't go in. We called in a search and rescue team. They arrived the next morning with dogs and gear. They went into the cave with masks and lights. They found bodies. 3 of them. One was just bones. The other 2 were more recent. One was missing a leg. All were in various stages of decay. They also found a bed of pine needles and grass deeper inside, like someone had been sleeping there. DNA tests later confirmed one of the bodies belonged to a missing hiker from 2 years back. The other 2 were never identified. They never found who or what was living in that cave. They sealed the ravine after that, closed the whole area to hikers and even rangers, said it was unstable, risk of rockfall. That was a lie. They didn't want anyone finding it again. I got transferred out 2 weeks later. Haven't been back since. But sometimes I dream about it. The footprints, the breathing, the cave. And I wonder, who was David Kay? And what did he see in there? Sometimes when I'm alone on patrol in the backcountry, I'll hear a branch snap or catch a whiff of that smell, the one like old rot, and I remember the sound of breathing in the dark. And I keep walking, always away from the ravines. I've been working as a park ranger for almost 15 years now. Most of it's routine, trail maintenance, search and rescue, visitor education, the usual. People like to think we just sit in towers or cruise around in trucks all day. It's not like that. You see a lot out here. Some of it's beautiful. Some of it sticks with you for the wrong reasons. This happened 8 years ago, back in early October. The weather had just started to cool down and the summer crowds were gone. That's when the forest really quiets down. If you've ever walked deep into the woods when there's no one around, you'll know what I mean. There's this stillness that settles over everything. Every small noise feels sharper. It makes you pay attention. I was stationed in a remote park in the Pacific Northwest. I won't name it. Don't want to stir anything up again. It's about 200 square miles of rugged forest, creeks, cliffs, and old logging roads that don't show up on most maps. There's a lot of backcountry space out there that no one ever really sees. But I had to patrol it. There was one particular part of the park I'd never been assigned to before. On our internal maps, it was marked as Hollow Creek Zone 7. That part of the forest had a reputation. Not for anything mystical, just being rough. Dense trees, steep ravines, unpredictable weather. The kind of place that could twist your ankle or break your neck if you weren't careful. People didn't usually hike out there. No trails, no lookouts, nothing to bring them in. But we'd gotten a report of some illegal campsites popping up along a dried creek bed that ran through Zone 7. A pair of hunters said they'd seen tarps, maybe a fire ring. That was enough for the higher-ups to send someone in. And since I was already familiar with the surrounding areas, I got the job. I packed for 2 nights. Took my usual gear, map, GPS, radio, first aid kit, flare gun, food, and my .45. We're not law enforcement, technically, but in these remote places you don't take chances. People do stupid things when they think no one's watching. Sometimes it's drugs. Sometimes it's something worse. It was a 4-hour hike to get to the edge of the zone, following an old fire road that had mostly been swallowed by ferns and pine needles. From there, I had to go on foot through unmarked forest. No trails, no saini, just me, my map, and the creek bed to follow. The first few hours were uneventful. Just dense woods, moss-covered rocks, fallen trees, the occasional deer trail. I found a creek bed about halfway through the day. It wasn't dry like the hunters said. It was barely a trickle, but still moving. The banks were steep and lined with thick brush. Not an ideal place to camp, but I guess some people didn't care. I started walking along the bank, checking for signs of recent activity. It was slow going. Branches kept snagging my pack, and I slipped more than once on the whetstones. Around dusk, I found what I was looking for. A cold fire pit, some broken branches arranged like a makeshift windbreak, a few beer cans. It wasn't fresh, maybe a week old, but it meant someone had been there. I made camp about a quarter-mile uphill from the site, set up my tent near a small outcrop. I always try to camp with a view when I can. Helps me keep a visual on the area and orient myself in the morning. That night was calm. Cold. The kind of cold that wakes you up if your sleeping bag shifts. I didn't hear anything strange, just owls and the distant rustle of wind through the trees. The next morning, I continued downstream. That's when things started to feel off. It wasn't anything big at first, just little things. I noticed the creek had narrowed more than expected. The banks were getting steeper, too, like a small canyon. I checked my map again. According to the topography, this shouldn't have happened yet. I should have still been in relatively flat terrain for another 2 miles. I took a break, pulled out my GPS. It wouldn't lock. That happens sometimes under heavy tree cover, but I was in a clearing. I gave a few minutes. Still nothing. I marked my position by hand on the map based on my pace and landmarks. I've always trusted compass and paper more than electronics anyway. As I moved farther, the forest changed. The trees were older here. Taller, denser, less undergrowth. It looked untouched. No signs of human presence at all. That might sound nice, but it made me uneasy. I don't like being somewhere in the woods where even animals seem scarce. You learn to read those signs over the years. If birds and deer avoid a place, you should wonder why. Then I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. On the far side of the creek, wedged between 2 massive cedar roots, was a backpack. Tan canvas, stained and sun-bleached. Old. I crossed over and crouched down to inspect it. It was torn, the zippers rusted. Looked like it had been out here for years. I opened it carefully. Inside was a metal mess tin, a broken compass, and a waterlogged journal. I flipped through it. The pages were swollen, barely legible. The ink had run on most of it, but I could make out a few dates from over a decade ago. One name was written several times, Rob Jensen. That caught my attention. Rob Jensen had been reported missing 15 years ago. A solo backpacker who went off trail and never came back. I remembered his case. No one ever found a body or gear. I radioed in. No answer. I tried again on all channels. Still nothing. Not even static. I looked up. No clouds, no wind. Perfect signal conditions. That's when the knot in my gut started. I marked the backpack's location on my map and kept moving, now more alert. I figured I'd follow the creek another mile, then double back. Something about this area didn't feel right. Not haunted or cursed, just wrong. I don't know how else to describe it. Like the forest was hiding something. About an hour later, I found a second site. It was a tarp shelter, half collapsed, faded green, covered in pine needles. Underneath were old sleeping bags, one torn open, stuffing spilling out. There was a pile of canned food, rusted through. And bones. Not human, thankfully. Probably deer or elk, picked clean. But someone had clearly stayed out here long term. There was even a rusted camp stove. I spent some time checking the area. Found a few more personal items. Boots, broken sunglasses, a plastic container full of matches and lint for kindling. And another journal. This one belonged to someone named E. Martin. A woman, based on some of the entries. Hers was more intact. She wrote about living out here alone, how she was done with people. The last entry was from 8 years ago. This part got to me. One of her last lines said, asterisk, haven't seen anyone in months. Starting to think no one ever comes this deep. Asterisk, then nothing. I camped nearby that night, though I barely slept. Every twig snapped, every gust of wind sounded louder. I kept thinking of all the people who'd been here and never left. I wasn't scared of ghosts or monsters. I was thinking about people. The kind of people who choose to vanish. The kind who don't want to be found. Or the kind who make sure no one ever finds others. The next morning, I started heading back. That's when I noticed something new. Footprints. They weren't mine. Wrong tread, wrong size. They were fresher than mine, too. Maybe a day old. They led away from the creek and up into a stand of trees that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. I followed them. About 30 minutes in, I found what I can only describe as a camp, but not like any I'd seen before. It wasn't made for comfort. It was made for concealment. Logs and brush stacked deliberately to hide the space from above. A shallow pit dug into the earth, blackened from fire. A pile of animal bones. Dozens. Maybe more. Skulls, ribs, femurs. All cleaned. Some arranged in strange, neat stacks. That wasn't the worst part. In the dirt were claw marks. Not from animals. From fingers. They were faint but unmistakable. Someone had tried to claw their way out of the pit. I froze. Every instinct in my body screamed to leave. Not to run, but to walk fast and steady like you do when you know something is watching. I backed out of the camp slowly, not touching anything. I didn't take photos. I didn't need to. That image is burned into my brain. On my way back to the creek, I saw more signs. A rope nailed between trees, with oldkins tied to it like a tripwire. Someone had made this place their territory. Someone who didn't want company. It took me a day and a half to hike out. My radio started working again about 3 miles from the fire road. I called in and filed a report. 2 hours later, law enforcement met me at the ranger station. I told them everything. I showed them the journals, the map, the photos I took of the first 2 sites. They launched a search. I heard later they found more camps. More remains. Partial skeletons. Most were animal, but not all. They identified 2 human sets, Rob Jensen and E. Martin. They also found a cabin. It was buried under brush, camouflaged, no trail leading in. Inside were shelves of preserved food, tools, knives, even a map with hand-drawn boundaries. Someone had lived there a long time, maybe more than one person. They never found anyone inside. The official report called it a series of isolated survivalist camps. That's what made it into the paper. Quietly handled. Nope. My name's Thomas Niles. I worked as a park ranger in Wyoming for 15 years. Mostly up in the Pine Bend region, a mix of rough hills, long pine forests, and deep valleys. Beautiful country, but isolated. The kind of place where your truck breaking down could mean spending a night out in the cold with no one coming until the next morning, if they even know where to look. This happened back in 2017. I was in my 10th year on the job, used to everything. Wild animals, dumb tourists, poachers, even the occasional survivalist trying to live off the land. You learn to expect the unexpected, but this one stayed with me. I never told the department about it. I didn't want to deal with the questions or the look in their eyes like maybe he was starting to lose it. I wasn't. We had a lookout post up by Miller Ridge, elevation around 8,200 feet. No cell service unless you had a booster. I'd spend 3 to 4 nights up there alone sometimes, checking trail conditions, weather instruments, making sure the cabins were stocked and clean for the next hikers or rangers coming through. There was a small log station, stove, cot, desk, radio, lanterns. No running water, but enough stored in big blue barrels to last the week. We had a rotation system. That month, Miller Ridge was mine. I started my shift on a Tuesday, drove the department truck up the service road, locked the gate behind me, and parked a few hundred feet from the trailhead. Hauled my gear to the station. The sun was dropping low. Cold wind, sky getting orange behind the hills. I remember the smell of pine needles and how damn quiet it was. You don't notice silence until it's full. That's what the forest feels like up there, full of quiet. The first night was normal. Did my checks, rode in the log, made some food on the stove, turned in around 10. It's always a little hard to sleep the first night. Every creak of the building or snap of a branch outside makes you perk up. But I'd done this dozens of times. Nothing out of the ordinary. Second day, I hiked out to mark a few fallen trees along the West Trail. Logged them with GPS so the maintenance team could deal with them later. Made it back by late afternoon. Cooked some beans and rice. Read an old paperback someone had left behind. Slept better that night. Things started getting weird on Thursday. Around 4 a.m., I woke up to a low thud outside. Not like a branch falling. Heavier. A single, deep hit, like something big stepping down onto frozen earth. I sat up and listened. Nothing followed. I figured it might have been a bear. We had grizzlies and black bears both, and sometimes one wandered near the station. I waited another 10 minutes, heard nothing, went back to sleep. Morning came clear and cold. Frost on the windows. I put on my boots and jacket, stepped outside, and circled the cabin. No tracks. Not a one. Ground was hard, but not frozen solid. If something heavy moved through, it should have left something. But it hadn't. I made a note of it in the log, mostly to cover my ass. No signs of bear, heard noise. Nothing to act on. That day, I took a hike south to check the fire tower. The one up on Long Pine Ridge, about 3 miles from Miller. I carried my pack, radio, and the Ruger we were issued for bears. Made the hike in just under 2 hours, did my checks, and sat for a while watching the valley below. There was movement, elk mostly, maybe a few mule deer. It was peaceful. On the way back, I found something that stopped me cold. About a half-mile from the fire tower, right off the trail, I saw a pile of stones. Not stacked, not shaped into anything, just dumped in a wide, tall heap about 4 feet across. Fresh dirt all around. The stones were too big to have rolled there. It looked like someone had gathered them up by hand. That by itself wasn't crazy. People do weird things out here. Little rock towers with sculptures, even impromptu campsites. But this wasn't that. There were animal bones in it. Not buried, mixed in. Half-buried skulls, ribs, long leg bones. I crouched and took a closer look. Some were deer, but others were smaller. Raccoons, maybe. All old, but not fossilized. Just weather-worn. Some still had scraps of dried hide clinging to them. And it smelled. That part got me. It shouldn't have smelled. These bones weren't fresh. But the dirt around them had a rank, sour odor, like rotting meat that had been kept under something heavy for too long. I took photos with my phone, tagged the spot and my GPS radioed it in. Just said I found unusual remains and would log the coordinates at base. They said okay. I didn't say more than that. I didn't sleep well that night. That thud from the night before kept coming back to me, playing in my head like a dropped bowling ball. I kept imagining something dragging those rocks, dumping them, stuffing bones into the pile. Why would someone do that? Some off-the-grid hunter? A cult thing? I'd read reports before of weird stuff found in national parks. Symbols carved into trees, weird shelters, even ritual sites. But this didn't feel like that. This felt personal. Close. Friday morning, I went back to the site with a small shovel and gloves. I want to take a deeper look before reporting it fully. I spent almost an hour digging around the base of the pile. No metal, no garbage, no signs of a campsite. But something stuck out, literally. A piece of flannel caught between 2 rocks. Faded red and black, like an old hunting jacket. I pulled at it, and the fabric came loose along with a small, broken zipper. That was enough. I didn't want to keep digging. I took it back to the station, sealed it in a Ziploc for my gear. That night, the noises came back. Same time, just before dawn. This time it wasn't a thud. It was footsteps, slow, crunching through the pine needles just outside the station wall. I turned off the lantern and held my breath. It circled the station, once, then twice. Never ran, never stopped, just walked. Heavy, methodical, whatever it was, it moved like a person. But the weight of it didn't feel right. It was too heavy. The ground shook under it like someone dragging a log. Then it stopped, right outside the door. No knock, no breathing, just stillness. I raised the Ruger, aimed at the door, and stayed that way for 15 minutes. Nothing moved. When the sun started rising, I opened the door fast, weapon raised, expecting, I don't know, something. But the clearing was empty. No footprints, no marks, just the same packed earth and pine needles. That morning, I made the call. I told the department I wasn't feeling well and needed to cut the shift early. Said I'd had trouble sleeping, might have picked up a stomach bug. I left out the bones, the cloth, the footsteps. They told me to hike back to the truck and head home, check in after the weekend. As I was packing my things, I found something behind the station, something that hadn't been there the day before. A small pile of rocks, only 5 or 6, but placed deliberately, stacked on top of each other like a marker. On top was a raccoon skull, clean and white. I didn't touch it. I just stared at it for a full minute before finishing my pack and leaving. The hike back to the truck felt longer than usual. I kept hearing things. Not animal sounds, those I know. This was snapping branches deep in the trees, like someone keeping pace just out of sight. I didn't run, but I didn't stop either. Every time I looked back, there was nothing. I reached the truck, started it, locked the doors, and drove until I hit the ranger station at the base of the valley. I didn't tell anyone what happened until now. I turned in the GPS coordinates and the photos I took. I submitted the cloth scrap as found trail debris. They filed it under unverified animal remains. No follow-up, no investigation. For the next year, I avoided the Miller Ridge assignment. I swapped with others, took lower trails, did desk work. Nobody questioned it. Then, in 2019, we got a report. A hiker had gone missing not far from Long Pine Ridge. Solo trekker, mid-30s, experienced. Went off trail. Last known coordinates were near that pile I found. They sent in search and rescue. Found his pack by a creek, but not the body. Just torn flannel and one boot. No blood. No tracks. They never found him. I don't know what's up there. I don't think it's a bear or a poacher or some survivalist. I think it's older than that. Not supernatural, just something natural that doesn't want to be found. Something that doesn't leave footprints. And it knows when you're alone. I've been off the force since 2021. Moved down south. Flatland, no forests. People all around. It's not as pretty, but I sleep better. The thing at Pine Bend never came back. But sometimes, when I wake up just before dawn, I think I hear footsteps outside the window. Just for a second. Heavy. Slow. Then they're gone. And I remind myself I'm not in the woods anymore. I remind myself, but I don't always believe it. I've worked as a park ranger in the Pacific Northwest for over 15 years. I've seen more than my share of strange things, lost hikers, injured animals, reckless campers, all the usual. But there was one week back in early October 2018 that still keeps me up at night. Nothing supernatural, no monsters in the dark, just a creeping fear that comes from realizing how little control we really have out there, and how quickly things can go wrong when people ignore that fact. The park I work in covers over 500,000 acres of forest, rivers, cliffs, and mountain ridgelines. The terrain's beautiful, rugged, and unpredictable. The kind of place where a broken ankle or a poor decision can mean the difference between life and death. Most of the time, people follow the rules. They check in, they carry the right gear, they stick to the trails. But every now and then, someone decides they know better. On October 3rd, Dispatch let me know about a missing solo hiker named Jeremy Laker. Mid-30s, experienced outdoorsman, or so his online post claimed. He'd told friends he was going to do a 5-day trek along the Ridgeline Loop, a 38-mile stretch that goes deep into the park's backcountry and takes you along some pretty unforgiving high ground. It's not a route I recommend for solo hikers, especially in shoulder season. Weather turns fast in those mountains. He hadn't checked in. No signal. No trace. His car was still parked at the southern trailhead. I was assigned to check the first leg of the trail, while a couple of the other rangers, Mark and Haley, went in from the north. We figured we'd meet somewhere around the halfway point if everything went smooth. It didn't. I packed up my usual gear, radio, med kit, bear spray, flare gun, GPS, the basics. The hike in was normal. Chilly air, low cloud cover, some light frost on the ground. Nothing out of the ordinary. The forest was quiet, which was typical for this time of year. Not many animals stirring unless you got close to a water source. By mid-afternoon, I reached the first of the shelters along the trail. Old wooden lean-tos built back in the 70s. They're dry but drafty. I checked the logbook nailed to the post. The last entry was from Jeremy, 3 days prior. Just a short note. Feeling good, weather holding, moving on a high ridge. That was it. I scanned the area. No gear left behind. No signs of struggle. No blood. No tracks heading off trail. I marked the location, radioed in my update, and kept going. The next day, I pushed higher up the ridge. This part of the trail snakes along a narrow shelf of exposed rock. One misstep, and you're falling 40 feet into a ravine full of deadfall. I moved slowly, scanning the trail for signs of Jeremy. Nothing. Then about 5 miles from the next shelter, I found something. It was a torn piece of nylon fabric, wedged under a dead branch near the edge of the trail. Bright blue, about the size of a bandana. I bagged it and kept moving. Not long after, I noticed fresh drag marks in the dirt. Not boot prints, but something being hauled. They ran parallel to the trail for maybe 50 yards, then vanished into the underbrush. I considered radioing it in, but decided to follow them first. I marked the trail with a small red flag and pushed into the brush. The forest thickened fast. Blackberry brambles tore my pants, and the ground was uneven. After about 100 yards, I came into a clearing where the light broke through. At first, I thought it was just a random patch of dead ground, but then I saw the fire pit. It wasn't a ranger-approved campsite. This one was makeshift, stones piled in a rough ring, blackened from repeated use. Around it were bits of trash, plastic wrappers, a torn water bladder, and a snapped tent pole. A ripped mylar blanket fluttered from a nearby branch. But no Jeremy. I took photos, bagged what I could for evidence, and hiked back to the main trail. When I radioed it in, Mark told me they'd found something too, an abandoned pack wedged under a log. Contents had been scattered by animals. No ID, but a GPS tracker matched the one Jeremy's friend said he was using. Signal had gone dead 2 days prior. That night, I set up camp just off the trail. I didn't sleep much. The wind howled through the trees, and I kept thinking about the fire pit. It hadn't been just one fire. There were layers of ash, signs of repeated use. Someone had been camping there for days, maybe longer. Morning came gray and cold. I pressed on toward the next shelter. As I rounded a bend near a rocky outcrop, I spotted movement down below in the ravine. I dropped to one knee, raised my binoculars. At first, I thought it was an animal. A deer maybe, but then it stood upright. A man, dirty clothes, matted hair. He moved slowly, cautiously, scanning the trees. I called out. No answer. I tried to get down the slope, but it was steep. By the time I reached the bottom, he was gone. I searched the area for 2 hours. Nothing. No tracks, no noise. Just silence. Something about that man's posture stuck with me. He wasn't walking like he was lost. He was sneaking. Later that day, I met up with Mark and Haley at the second shelter. They found more signs, strips of cloth tied to trees, like makeshift trail markers. But they didn't match any rescue methods. Wrong color, wrong spacing. Haley said it reminded her of when poachers mark animal paths. We reviewed the maps. Jeremy's route should have had him looping back already. Instead, it looked like he'd gone off course, possibly on purpose. The area he'd veered into was less traveled, no maintained trails, just old logging roads and dense forest. We decided to follow that path the next day. That night, around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of snapping branches. I lay still, listening. It wasn't wind. It was deliberate. Something or someone moving slowly outside the tent perimeter. I waited, hand on my bear spray, until the noise faded. In the morning, I found tracks. Human, barefoot. The prints circled our tents once, then vanished into the trees. We pressed deeper into the off-trail zone. The undergrowth made every step difficult. Around midday, we found a small stream, and alongside it, more debris. An old tarp, torn and sun-bleached. Zustettin a pair of moldy boots. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just someone lost. Someone had been living out here. Days later, we found the cabin. It was a half-collapsed structure, probably dating back to the 50s. One room, sagging roof, broken windows. We approached carefully. The place smelled of smoke, rot, and mildew. Inside, the floor was covered in trash, ripped magazines, animal bones, canned food wrappers. In one corner, a pile of clothes, mostly shredded. Among them, a jacket matching Jeremy's description. We searched the area thoroughly. No one was there, but on the back wall of the cabin, someone had scratched words into the wood. Over and over, "They hear you when you speak." We didn't know what to make of it. No sign of Jeremy. No body. No blood. We radioed for a full search team and stayed at the site until backup arrived. Over the next 4 days, 20 people combed the woods. They found more signs of habitation. Small traps, carved sticks, a crude bow, but no people. Eventually, we had to call it. Jeremy Laker was listed as presumed dead. Official cause, exposure, possibly injury, but no one found remains. His parents requested to keep the case open. That was almost 7 years ago. Last month, a hunter reported someone watching him from the trees near the same ridge. So the man didn't speak, didn't move, just stared. Disappeared when approached. We went back out there. Same woods. Same eerie silence. We found a new fire pit. Still warm. That place changes you. Not because of what's in the dark, but because of what isn't. No answers. No clear ending. Just a growing sense that some people go into those woods not to get lost, but to disappear. I've been a park ranger for almost 12 years now. Most days, the job is quiet. I patrol the trails, checking on campgrounds, and keep an eye out for people who don't respect the rules. But every so often, something comes along that reminds me how unforgiving the wilderness can be. This story isn't about ghosts or ancient curses. It's about the way nature can swallow a person whole when no one's looking. This happened during my 5th year working in the mountains of northern Idaho. The park I was assigned to was huge. Over 300,000 acres of rough terrain, thick forests, and deep, winding canyons. There were dozens of trails, most well-maintained and marked, but there were also stretches of backcountry where maps didn't mean much and GPS signals were patchy at best. That's where I spent most of my time, making sure hikers weren't biting off more than they could chew. It was mid-September. The trees were just starting to turn and the crowds had thinned out. The mornings were cold, the afternoons warm, and the air was sharp with the smell of pine and dry leaves. I was out on a solo patrol that week, assigned to check a stretch of trail that had been closed earlier in the summer due to rock slides. We'd recently reopened it, but the area was still remote, technically backcountry, even though it was marked. My plan was to hike out about 14 miles to an old fire watch cabin near the ridge, stay the night, then circle back along a different route. I had my gear, food, satellite phone, radio, and enough water to last me 2 days. I knew the area well, but even so, I always took precautions. I was expected to check in every 6 hours. If I missed a check-in by more than 3 hours, the station would send someone after me. I set off early in the morning, just after sunrise. The trail was steep and the brush was thick in some parts, but it was manageable. For the first 8 miles, everything was normal. I found signs of recent hikers, boot prints, some snack wrappers, even a fire pit that had been smothered properly. Around mile 9, the trail started to show signs of washout. A landslide earlier that year had torn up a section of the path, and though crews had cleared the debris, the ground was still soft and unstable in spots. I took my time, picking my steps carefully. By early afternoon, I was around mile 12 and still making good time. The terrain was quiet, not much wildlife stirring. That's always a little unsettling, not wrong, just eerie. In the denser parts of the forest, the sound dies down. No wind, no birds, just the crunch of your boots and your own breathing. I kept moving, trying to reach the cabin before nightfall. That's when I found the first thing that didn't sit right. Just off the trail, maybe 20 feet into the brush, I saw something out of place. A bright blue scrap of fabric caught in a branch. I pushed through the undergrowth and found a torn-up backpack, half buried in leaves. It was old, faded from the sun, the zippers rusted. I checked the tag, but there was no name. Inside, there were the usual things: crushed energy bars, a water bottle with mold at the bottom, a map printed from a home printer, soaked and crumbling. The weird part was how it was positioned. It wasn't like someone dropped it or forgot it. It looked like it had been thrown or yanked. There were drag marks in the dirt leading away from it, deep ones like someone had slid downhill or been pulled. I followed the marks for about 10 yards before they disappeared into harder ground. I looked around but didn't find anything else. No shoes, no other gear, no signs of an injured person. I marked the location on my GPS and made a note to report it when I checked in. Could have been from years ago, maybe a hiker who got hurt and managed to walk out, leaving their pack behind. Still, it fell off. I reached the cabin just before dusk. It was in decent shape, though the front door had to be forced a little. Inside was the usual: 2 cots, a table, some emergency supplies, and a logbook. I signed my name, recorded the time, then stepped out to get a signal for my check-in. That's when I saw the footprints. Fresh ones. Not mine. They came up from the west side of the ridge, not the trail I'd used. The dirt was dry, so they stood out clearly. Heavy boots, maybe size 10 or 11. The pattern was different from mine, deeper, spaced out wider. Whoever made them had been moving fast. I followed them around the side of the cabin. They stopped at the back wall, where I found an old water pump, dry and rusted. Then they turned around and disappeared back the way they came. I stood there for a while, just listening. Nothing. No wind. No movement. No animals. I don't scare easy, but something about those prints made my skin crawl. They weren't there when I first approached the cabin. I would have seen them. That meant whoever made them had been nearby, watching, maybe even following me. I spent that night inside the cabin with the door locked and my bear spray within arm's reach. I didn't sleep much. Around midnight, I heard something moving in the trees. Not an animal. Heavy steps, breaking branches. They circled the cabin once, then faded. I didn't dare go outside. The radio was still working, and I debated calling it in, but I didn't want to trigger a rescue response if it was just a hunter passing through. At first light, I packed up and started back a different way, down a longer, less used fire road that looped south. I figured it was safer than going back the same way I came. About 3 miles down, I found something else. A clearing, maybe 50 feet across, with signs of an old camp. Ashes from fire, stacked stones, some cans. But what really got me was the pile of bones. Small animal bones, picked clean. Rabbits, birds, maybe a fox. Arranged in a circle. Not ritualistic, just placed. Carefully. Like someone had time to kill and was getting creative. I've seen what hungry animals can do, but this didn't look like their work. More boot prints led away from the camp, heading deeper into the woods. I followed them for a while, but turned back after a quarter mile. No point risking getting lost or running into someone unstable. I marked the location and moved on. When I finally made it back to the ranger station next day, I filed a full report. They sent a team out to check the backpack, the camp, and the prints. They didn't find much. The bag had no ID. The bones were real but cleaned by time, not fire. The prints had been rained over by then. No sign of the person who made them. Over the next few weeks, I kept going back into that area, hoping to find more clues. A missing person report, a tip, anything. But nothing turned up. No one matching the prints ever came forward. No one was reported lost in that area recently. It was like someone had been living out there under the radar. A few months later, we got a call from a group of hikers who found an old tent, torn and rotting, about 2 ridges south of the cabin. Inside were more cans, some tools, a rusted knife, and a journal. Most of the pages were too damaged to read, but a few had survived. They weren't helpful. Just ramblings about the forest, the cold, hunger. No names. No clear dates. The last entry was chilling in its simplicity. Still hear them at night. Moving closer. Don't know how long I can stay quiet. To this day, I don't know who wrote that. We never found a body, and no more signs ever turned up. The area is still open, but we tell hikers to stick to the main trails and report anything strange right away. What sticks with me most isn't what I found. It's what I didn't. Someone out there went missing or chose to disappear. Someone lived out there long enough to go half mad or paranoid. And someone followed me that night without leaving a trace afterward. That's the thing about the wilderness. It doesn't need monsters or legends to be terrifying. Sometimes it's just the silence, the empty trails, and the sense that someone or something knows exactly where you are, even when you think you're alone. I've been a park ranger for 15 years now. Seen all kinds of things: injured hikers, bears getting too close to trails, even a guy who tried to live out in the woods on nothing but pine nuts and hallucinations. But there's one stretch of trail I'll never forget. It's in the backcountry of a national forest I won't name. It's not on any official map anymore, and after what happened, I made damn sure it stays that way. It started late one September. That's the time of year when the forest gets quiet. Summer campers are gone, kids are back in school, and the cold starts to creep in. I was stationed at a remote ranger outpost, one of those log cabin type places with no running water and a radio that only works when it feels like it. My job was simple: monitor fire risks, check on trail conditions, and keep an eye out for stragglers or idiots who thought fall was a good time for solo hikes. A report came in through the satellite terminal. It was flagged as low priority, but still needed a ranger to look into it. A wildlife survey team, the kind that does seasonal check-ins on wolf populations, had abandoned a camera trap grid halfway through their run. The note said they'd pulled out early due to unusual predator behavior, but they didn't elaborate. They left behind a few trail cams and supply canisters near something they called the Hollow Trail. That was odd because I'd never heard of any trail by that name, and I knew every official and unofficial path in my section. I figured it was an old hunter's trail or maybe just a local name. Either way, they wanted someone to go in, recover the equipment, and report back. So I packed up my gear, basic stuff: GPS, bear spray, emergency beacon, extra batteries, and enough food and water for 2 nights. I wasn't expecting to stay long, but I always over-prepare. I loaded it into my old green Polaris ATV and set off down the service roads. After a couple of hours and a lot of brush clearing, I reached the grid coordinates. From the start, things fell off. The forest was different, older. The trees were huge, mostly pine and spruce, with thick underbrush that made every step loud and clumsy. It was quiet too, not just peaceful, but dead quiet. No birdsong, no wind in the trees, not even the buzz of insects. Just the sound of my own boots crunching through dead needles and the occasional creak of my pack straps. The GPS was glitchy, which didn't surprise me. Those older forests are dense enough to interfere with the signal. I followed the coordinates as best I could, relying more on compass bearings and topography than electronics. About 2 miles in, I found the first trail cam. It was strapped to a tree and still active, its little red light blinking. That meant the battery was good. I powered it down and stowed it in my pack. A few more steps, and I found a marker flag, orange tape tied around branch. Standard practice for marking survey paths. That told me I was close to their route. I followed the flags, spaced every 50 yards or so, and picked up 2 more cameras. Still no sign of wildlife, or even droppings. Just old trees and that unshakable silence. By late afternoon, I reached a spot where the flags suddenly stopped. No sign of a campsite, just a clearing about 20 feet wide. The ground there was different, bare dirt, no pine needles, like something had swept it clean. I paused to take a drink and noticed something weird about the tree line. It was circular, too even, too precise. Nature doesn't do symmetry like that. I checked my map. There was no trail, no name, no indication anything had ever been here. But right across the clearing, I saw a narrow path cut into the brush. It wasn't recent, but it wasn't overgrown either. The kind of trail that stays alive because something keeps using it. I should have turned around. That's what my gut told me. But I figured I'd go a little further, maybe another mile, just to see if the last cameras were down that path. I stepped into the trail and immediately noticed the temperature drop. Not by much, maybe 5 degrees, but it was enough to make me zip up my jacket. The trees on either side leaned in close, branches touching overhead, forming a kind of tunnel. The light dimmed, even though the sun was still up. That trail kept going and going. I kept track of my time, but the forest started playing tricks on me. I'd walk for what felt like 5 minutes, then check my watch and see that an hour had passed. I chalked it up to the canopy and the terrain, maybe some disorientation from silence, but still felt wrong. Eventually, I came across the last camera. It was broken, ripped off the tree, and smashed into the dirt. The metal casing was dented, plastic lens shattered. No claw marks, no bite damage, just brute force destruction. That made my hair stand up. Bears might paw at things, sure, but this looked like someone or something grabbed it and slammed it down over and over. I decided that was far enough. I turned around and started heading back. But after maybe 100 yards, I realized I wasn't seeing the same landmarks. The bent tree I passed earlier was gone. The weird lichen-covered stump wasn't there. The trail looked the same, but different. I stopped, got out the compass. The needle spun for a few seconds before settling, but it didn't match the direction I came from. I tried the GPS again. Nothing. Just a blinking no signal. That's when the panic started to build. I wasn't lost, not exactly. I'm trained to read terrain, to track my steps, but this place didn't behave like the rest of the forest. The more I tried to retrace, the more everything blended together. I marked a tree with a notch for my knife, walked 10 minutes, then circled back, and the mark was gone. Or maybe I never reached the same spot again. Night fell fast. I had no choice but to make camp. I found a small rise with a bit of dry ground and set up my tarp and sleeping pad. I didn't light a fire. Something told me not to. Instead, I sat in the dark, listening. Still no birds, no bugs, no wind. Just that heavy silence pressing in on me like a weight. At some point, I must have dozed off. I woke up cold, heart pounding, like something had jolted me out of sleep. I didn't hear anything, but I felt watched. I stayed still, hand on my bear spray, staring into the trees. That's when I noticed the trees ahead of me, barely visible in the moonlight, were moving. Not swaying, but shifting, as if something large was walking just behind them. I couldn't see what it was, just that the shape and spacing of the trunks kept changing. A slow, steady movement. No sound. I didn't sleep again that night. At first light, I packed up and tried a new direction, heading east with the rising sun behind me. It was rough going, steep slopes and thick brush, but I pushed through. I climbed a small ridge and finally saw something familiar, a radio tower in the distance. It was at least 3 miles off, but gave me a reference point. That's when I smelled it. Rot. Not the usual forest decay, but fresh death. I followed it, thinking maybe I'd find a dead elk or bear, something to explain the quiet. But what I found was a shredded nylon pack, torn to ribbons and half buried under leaves. Nearby, a cracked plastic storage case, the kind of survey teams use for cameras and data cards. No blood, no bones, just wreckage, and a single boot, upright, laces still tied. I didn't stop to investigate. I just got out of there. It took me the rest of the day to reach the service road, and from there I rode the ATV back to base. I filed my report, but I left out the parts no one would believe. I said I found the cameras, that some were damaged, that the team likely got spooked by predator activity, maybe a territorial bear. I never mentioned the trail, or the boot, or how the forest itself seemed to move around me. A few weeks later, I went back with the crew. We brought GPS trackers, drones, the works. We couldn't find the hollow trail. The clearing was gone. The survey gear had been logged as lost. Sometimes when I think back on it, I wonder if I stumbled into a part of the forest people were never meant to enter. A place that changes when it wants to. Maybe the old survey team got too close to something they shouldn't have. Maybe that's why they pulled out early without explaining. All I know is I don't go back there. I don't even point it out on maps. If hikers ask about that section of the forest, I tell them it's closed for restoration or fire damage. I let the forest keep its secrets. But every so often, when I'm out on patrol and the trees start to feel too close, too quiet, I remember the way those trunks moved. Like something massive was walking just out of sight. And I keep walking. Fast.